With no need for further description, here's part 2 of my top 132 favorite video games list. If by chance you missed the last video and might be wondering about this text-to-speech voice, I have a community post detailing why. With that said, onto the list. Honorable mention: Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy. I'll start off by admitting I'm biased towards 3D platformers, so as this game belongs to said classification, that indirectly elevates this title higher up the list, even though truthfully I find this an average entry in the overall genre. To begin, I just see this game as a generic 3D platformer that doesn't have any qualities to separate it from the rest of the pack, and in no way can it compare to the Nintendo 64 classics. Say what you will about Donkey Kong 64, but the characters of that game oozed personality, and had innuendo-driven dialogue that you'll remember decades later, whereas the titular playable lead of Jak doesn't even speak in this entry, and you can't even manipulate that aspect into an argument of the says more by saying nothing archetype, since the story lacks moral quandaries to do so. In addition to that too, the side characters felt bland as well, like even though they may have visually different designs, in most cases they lack any sort of distinguishable trait to stand out. The one exception I might write off would be the elderly mentor of the heroes. Likewise, Super Mario 64 explored a wondrous castle where one could jump through paintings to discover new worlds, whereas this game for a setting just featured an island, one that did include a variety of locations, beaches, swamps, icy mountains and fiery canyons, but it still lacked the fantasy, or just some element or theme to make it feel unique. On this topic, I felt the game could have also extracted more identity from the areas themselves, instead of just feeling like any standard environment. To me, the area that brought out the most originality would have been Misty Island, which harbored pools of dark energy that corrupted everything, and the fact that massive bones populate the locale further supplements the impression that it ravages the life out of everything nearby. The primary collectible of the game, power cells, also rub off as a bit unnatural to the story, or only included because all other 3D platformers have something similar. They do have an in-game purpose of powering up machines to unlock the next region of the overworld, but again they just feel forced to have a purpose, like collect 40 power cells to charge a machine to lift this rock blocking this path, when it just feels like you could find some other way around it. I'll also claim the villains seem a bit purposeless or detached from the story, like they only appear a few times in the game and they don't really have strong motivation either, or at least one that entangles the protagonist all that deeply. The mentor character implies the dark energy from Misty Island corrupted their natures, which urged them to want to spread it around, and for some reason it's up to the protagonists to stop them. So again, they just feel included because video games generally need villains, so basically just to check off an unwritten box rather than out of necessity. Onto what I liked about this game. As stated earlier, I enjoy 3D platformers about collecting stuff, and I thought this title got creative in hiding them under bridges, inside waterfalls, jumping on a defeated boss's body causing some to get spit up, or tricking enemies into breaking boxes containing them, which by the way you can't open yourself. Some qualities that gave this title a little identity involved riding ostrich-like animals or gaining temporary power-ups to acquire new abilities such as throwing fireballs or magnetizing yourself, so you attract certain collectibles. One issue I've heard many people complain about, that personally wasn't too difficult for me, was a fishing minigame that entailed catching a large quantity of fish without netting any poisonous ones. As contradictory as this may sound, it was easy to win, but also easy to lose, as one minor mistake would force you to restart the entire challenge over again. On a side note, I actually earned a platinum trophy for this game on the PlayStation 3 release. Writing this after the completion of my list, I must make an admission that I originally planned to place this title in part 1 of this video series, but because of an oversight while reorganizing the exact order of everything, I accidentally forgot to include this game at that time. So instead of outright omitting this title and messing up the number continuity, I deemed it better to just open up part 2 with this game instead. 90. Oddworld: Stranger's Wrath. To begin, I see this game as a prime example of something that started off strong, but lost steam, and concluded weak, primarily due to breaking away from its original selling point, while also feeling kind of rushed and contrived. For those who don't know, the plot of Stranger's Wrath follows the escapades of a mysterious bounty hunter known as Stranger, where in a gritty fantasy western environment he captures outlaws to collect the prices on their heads for some unknown procedure he seeks, but about 2/3 of the way through, the story pulls a complete 180 and shifts to where he has to liberate a tribe of amphibians from an evil water baron, cutting off their water supply. Much like the nature of its narrative progression, the setting also changes by assuming a more modern, industrial-like locale. Normally I'm a fan of wide variety of terrains and backdrops in video games, but in this case, it really lost its spirit in the process. Likewise, it also came at the cost of sacrificing its charm as well, the first few areas consisted of goofy hillbilly chicken people only to move on to a tribe of amphibians with annoying squeaky voices. Besides that, the attitude became a bit too preachy for my tastes by the end. Even the gameplay changed towards the latter half, as during the bounty hunting first half of the plot, the gameplay greater emphasized aspects like exploration and movement, but nearing the end when Stranger intently pursued one target, the game changed to a more linear path while also assuming a style more akin to the traditional first-person shooter, or at least increasing its importance from prior levels. Now I understand why some would justify this tonal shift, as undeniably it holds thematic implications, like when Stranger chases an indirect dream built off of what-ifs, i.e. a surgery that he thinks will solve all his problems. When it only addresses a symptom, the game feels more loose and open-ended, but once he focused on a more direct calling, basically bringing down one specific person, in essence the cause of his problem, the gameplay mirrors the symbolism and becomes more straightforward as well. Speaking personally, just because something may hold artistic merit, doesn't automatically mean you have to like it, especially if it influences gameplay, which in my case led to the alteration of the style that I preferred into something less favorable, and that's my sentiment for why I didn't exactly appreciate how Stranger's Wrath felt like a completely different work by the end. Similarly, one may defend this artistic bait and switch, since the greater franchise of Oddworld already incorporated similar themes in all prior entries. For those who don't know, they all followed a premise of liberating enslaved workers from an evil company, so again one might argue that the transition to Stranger aiding a tribe of oppressed amphibians from a corrupt businessman kept it in line with the overarching point of the series, but to me this aspect felt like a contrived and unnecessary limb. In all honesty, I think the story would have worked better without trying to weave those elements into the narrative, as the plot already foreshadowed the lead as having a grudge against the villain, as a cutscene portrayed the antagonist requesting Stranger to hunt down an exotic creature for him, to which he responded by saying, "Just tell me where to find you," not to spoil anything, but Stranger has a connection to what the corrupt water baron seeks, and in that moment he indirectly implies something along the lines of, "I'm coming for you," so that's why I feel the insertion of the liberation plotline added in an unnecessary limb into the story, since it indirectly refocuses the plot away from the protagonist. In regards to why I called the conclusion of the game rushed, stems from the battle against the final boss feeling a bit lazy. First off, in round 1 you have to fight an old boss, except 2 of them at the same time, and then after that, the fight against the main antagonist involves him piloting a generic floating sphere that fired lasers, so from my perspective the final boss felt uncreative. Switching gears, Stranger's Wrath absolutely succeeded in establishing an unearthly ambience, which in turn also produced a certain charm. For example, when moving at a normal speed the character of Stranger stands bipedally, but to up the pace he drops down to all fours to accelerate. Besides presenting him as inhuman, this characteristic also plays up how the world itself seems foreign. Another quality supporting its unearthly charm regards how Stranger doesn't resort to actual arrows for his crossbow-like weapon, but instead uses living ammo, all of which possess interesting effects: thud slugs which produce a concussive effect, explosive bats, electric insects that increase in power the longer you wait to use them, and also the fuzzles, which in addition to mauling their target also serves as a callback to prior Oddworld game, Munch's Odyssey, where they appeared too. On the topic of combat, as Stranger fulfills the role of a bounty hunter, after he subdued or killed his enemies, he sucked them up into a vessel to store them, so that he can later turn them into the authorities to collect the reward. In all honesty, I just really like that aspect. Again, to sum up my thoughts, Oddworld Stranger's Wrath started off masterfully, but in pursuing a deeper meaning it lost itself. 89. Silent Hill 4, The Room. Controversially, I view this game as thematically superior to its highly touted, especially among YouTube analysts, predecessor Silent Hill 2. For the record, I still call the latter the overall better installment in the series, and only lesser to 4 in the department of themes and maybe controls. But with that said, I begin with a personal story of how I experienced the game, which semi-affected my time with this title. Now, with the prior entries of this franchise I had played them in the order of release, so this would be my 4th, and with those prior 3 I struggled adapting to the series' tank controls, and because of that issue I immediately tackled Silent Hill 4 after finishing the 3rd installment, since I had become accustomed to the series' infamous handling. Basically, I believed that if I spaced my playthrough out any further from 3, I thought my hands would have lost the proper muscle memory for the game, and returning any later would mean I would have had to readapt to the correct handling again. Proverbially, I wanted to strike while the iron is hot, but much to my surprise, when I loaded up this 4th entry I learned that it had shed the infamous tank controls in favor of the more standard style, which needless to say resulted in an opposing effect where it took me a while of getting used to a different control scheme once again. Anyways, this alteration doesn't really influence my scoring of this game. but this ordeal comes to mind when I think of Silent Hill 4. On to why I view this title as thematically a great game. To begin, the antagonist of Walter Sullivan. To start off, his presence in the game expands upon some briefly referenced lore from Silent Hill 2, where a newspaper article detailed how a paranoid convicted murderer exhibited fear over feeling hunted by an entity he referred to as the Red Devil, which in-game operates as a foreshadowing to the introduction of the second entry's iconic enemy known as Pyramid Head. First off, I really like how this edition extrapolates an entire story over a relatively minor log from a prior entry in the franchise, as it fleshes out the universe of this series. With that said though, I must admit that 4's inclusion of Walter Sullivan as a character retcons, if not defeats the purpose of the article explaining his situation from Silent Hill 2, not to go too deep into it, but I'll say the 4th entry rewrites his account as more literal when the intention of his role in the second title suggested his fears to be interpreted as more psychological, so it kind of changes the established folklore in the greater continuity, but in my opinion I'm not too upset by this revision, since I think Silent Hill 4 did some interesting things with these alterations to produce some great themes and symbolism, plus since his part in Silent Hill 2 can be very easily glossed over, I'm willing to overlook this inconsistency. Back to Sullivan's role in 4, now what writes him out as an interesting and complex villain pertains to the application of the theme of duality to his character, which the game explores in a variety of manners. In design he has heterochromia, or two different colored eyes. Through appearances sometimes he shows up as a fully grown adult, and other times as a child. As implied during the events of Silent Hill 2, he had long since perished, but in this sequel you encounter both his ghost, as well as his corpse. Besides that too, in spite of his spiritual disembodiment, his apparition assumes many qualities of the living, such as retaining his sense of self, as well as from how he still walks on the ground, in contrast to the other spiritual entities of this title who mostly just mindlessly float around attacking whatever nears them. Similarly, sometimes the ghost of Walter Sullivan will with an almost childlike innocence act amiable towards the player, while in other moments he'll aggressively pursue them with a chainsaw. What also embodies his duality regards how even though he may commit criminal actions, most of his targets aren't necessarily innocent or good either. Like one of the victims that you later encounter in the story happens to be an abusive prison guard, who personally tormented him as a child. Several others include crazy cultists that also made him suffer, a lady of the night who called him attractive, but filthy, so she demeaned him, or another case revolves around how he witnessed a future casualty of his rough up and humiliate what he unknowingly perceived as an innocent man. With all that said, the game doesn't necessarily justify his actions, but it at least puts you into a perspective of understanding why he did what he did. In essence, even though without a doubt he executed evil deeds, the fact that he primarily carried them out on questionable people demonstrates how even though as a character he may be in the wrong, a kernel of truth still exists in his rationale, hence showcasing the duality of his mind and identity. Besides that too, when one character read journals detailing his tragic upbringing, they expressed sympathy towards him, which also proves how even though his actions might be wicked, as a person he isn't necessarily all bad. Extrapolating this into a new theme, a recurring motif of the Silent Hill franchise involves how a troubled person's mind influences the paranormal world around them, and the story of Silent Hill 4, The Room follows how through the indirect influence of the murderous Walter Sullivan, seemingly trapped the protagonist inside his own apartment room with no means of contact to the outside world. Essentially he can see what goes on outside, but none can gaze in to see him, though I should mention that later on through a hole in the wall, the hero gains access to locations outside of his room, disconnected and fragmented areas important to the history and memory of Walter Sullivan. Now the concept of being locked in a room ties into the game's themes in a multitude of ways, one being in how people deal with trauma or harassment. Like you could interpret the killer, Walter Sullivan, is the type of tormented person who snapped and lashed out at his oppressors, while the idea of feeling confined to a room examines the other end of a tortured soul, the guy who refuses to leave their so-called safe space, because the outside world can feel uncomfortable, even if they yearn for a sense of belonging. Anyways, I've got more to say about this topic, but I need to continue on to other matters regarding this game, but the fact I rambled on for so long about one character and his depth kind of highlights why I see value in Silent Hill 4. With that said though, after speaking all this praise for this title as well as its themes and symbolism, one might expect this game to rate much higher than it presently does, but in all honesty I still view it as a very flawed game, especially with most aspects not involving the villain. Besides that too, I think Silent Hill 4 adhering too much to applying a deeper meaning to the story unintentionally came off as a hindrance at certain points. For example, the game forced in several mechanics that frequently required you, the player, to return to the namesake room of this game, which as an inclusion supplements the notion of it feeling inescapable or even in a certain sense replicates the mindset of the antagonist who constantly obsesses over this location. Now even though thematically this concept works, it just adds several layers of repetition to the gameplay to do so, such as how in contrast to the earlier Silent Hill titles, this entry limited the space of the player's inventory, but in turn allowed for you to store additional items in a chest back in the protagonist's apartment. Now because of this spatial limitation, and with how often this game throws necessary to finish the story objects at you, dozens of situations force you to go back home just to offload equipment, which just disrupts the pacing and quickly becomes monotonous. On a side note, most ammo doesn't stack either, so each new clip takes up its own space, meaning you constantly have to drop them off as well. On top of that too, later on a companion joins your quest and their weapon occupies a slot in your inventory too, so the game openly feels like it goes out of its way to reduce the size of your inventory, thus compelling you to go back to the room. Again, thematically I deem this great, but it hampers the gameplay and makes the experience less enjoyable. To be fair, the inclusion of a storage unit separate from the player's own inventory produced a memorable puzzle, where a door required a cursed key to open, but its hex prevented you from exiting the forest of which it happened to be located. Basically, it would force you to endure an unlimited loop as long as it stayed in your possession, so in order to bring it back to its lock, you had to drop it off at the chest in your apartment, warp back to the forest, exit the normal way, and then teleport back to the apartment to collect said key, return, and then use it on the door. Undeniably as a puzzle this functions as a cool idea, but because of the redundancy of having to constantly go back and forth between the room and the current area recurs so frequently, the wasted time just overshadows this feature. And the limited inventory space isn't a positive either, even if you argue that it supplements the immersion of this feeling like a survival horror game. Similarly, the concept of being confined to a small room almost perfectly coincides with the fear of claustrophobia, and as such the game incorporated many narrow passageways into its levels, but unfortunately this made several areas an absolute pain to traverse. Like one location involved riding up an enclosed escalator, where dozens of humanoid creatures protruded out of the surrounding walls, and if one of their hard-to-dodge attacks landed you get launched backwards. In addition to that, finding the proper timing to inflict damage back at them could be a challenge also, so this made several sections of the game feel like a slog. Again, in discussing these segments it will sound awesome, but experiencing them can easily become infuriating. Tangentially, I also have to say the controls felt like a bit of a downgrade from its predecessor, which too makes these tight areas all the more nightmarish. Another way how a good theme unintentionally tarnished Silent Hill 4 involved how the writers of the story went so hard at constructing the protagonist as an everyman that he just rubs off as an unmemorable, bland, empty shell. In context this works, as the narrative of the game pretty much intends to represent how a normal dude randomly found himself in the web of a serial killer, but it still doesn't negate the fact that he virtually doesn't feel like an actual part of the story. On a side note, I don't view this as exclusive to the protagonist, as other than the main antagonist, the rest of the cast isn't exactly impressive either. I do have to utter one more praise of the game and how it did a decent job of expressing the cause and effect actions of the characters/events, like throughout the many worlds of this title the ghostly victims of Walter Sullivan will attempt to hunt or in this case hunt you down. By the way, they aren't locked to one specific area, so something that debuted in World 2 can reappear in later ones as well. Now the game grants you some special pins that conceal these apparitions to the floor, which can present some neat effects. Like in level 4 you are supposed to experience a scripted segment where a spirit chases you up a rotating staircase, which for the record I view as an excellent scene, but when I watched someone else's playthrough of the game, I noticed they pinned that ghost down at an earlier point, which permitted them to just walk up these same steps unperturbed. So I just find it remarkable how your past choices influence the course of the story. Besides the fact that this aspect can basically personalize your own playthrough also comes off as cool. To end this off, a good way to sum up Silent Hill 4, the room would be by saying, discussing the game itself is more enjoyable than actually playing it. 88. Little Big Planet. A very unique 3D platformer molded in the style of a 2D platformer. I chose to word the opening sentence as such, since this game rewrote many rules of gaming. For instance, even though this title explores depth, it didn't follow the traditional route of a 3D platformer, i.e. not opening up the perspective to a full 360-degree world, and instead opted to add extra layers to the foreground, basically including a z-coordinate on an XY axis map, which no pun intended brought new dimensions to the landscape of platformers. For all intents and purposes, it basically allowed you to interact with parts of the environment that would normally exist as only untouchable backdrops. Like in a village environment, besides just walking in front of houses, you could also move to the back layer to climb up them as well, which also allowed for more intricate placing of collectibles too. On a side note, Little Big Planet released during an era where 2D platformers had been borderline abandoned or at least relegated to handhelds, the less respected medium of gaming at the time. How this game also revolutionized the simulated style of 2D platformers regarded how it introduced the power of the at its time modern consoles to an old format, which allowed it to play with elements like physics and destructible environments in ways never done before. Besides the story mode, another major aspect of Little Big Planet pertained to how it permitted you, the player, to create your own custom levels and upload them to the internet for others to play. For reference, the previously mentioned collectibles consisted of bubbles containing the various objects found during story mode, which once attained could be used in your own levels. Similarly, you could customize your playable character, known as Sackboy, to the same extent as well, dressing him up in various outfits, pasting textures with alterable sizes onto his body, and you could even modify his facial expressions. To address the elephant in the room, and how it stacks up to the other major create-your-own-level themed game, Super Mario Maker, now I'll say without a doubt the latter better streamlined the creation process and made it easier to produce your own good levels, but on that note it lacked the possibilities or potential of Little Big Planet. Like in this PlayStation 3 classic, if you have no idea what you're doing, stuff can easily go wrong, especially cause of its advanced physics, but if one understands its machinations, you can construct any Mario level and then some. Whereas I can't say the same for Super Mario Maker replicating those of Little Big Planet. I'll just state this too: I witnessed both games attempt at recreating a Bioshock-themed level, and Mario Makers still felt like any old Mario level, whereas Little Big Planets not only captured the look of the aforementioned title, but also resembled nothing from the main game. In essence, its versatility and customization allowed it to be more than just a Little Big Planet level, and that fact alone proves this whole idea. One thing that holds me back from rating this title higher regards how at times it felt too immature, but at the same time, it may have inadvertently resulted in one of the most memorable aspects about the game for me, which involved how one song on its soundtrack consisted of what sounds like distorted voices of children chanting in gibberish. Now besides that, it just also induces a very unique and original ambience. On a brief tangent, I never felt like I fully experienced Little Big Planet because it later released a Metal Gear Solid themed downloadable content pack, which also introduced a new paintball firing mechanic to the gameplay. And for those who don't remember me saying this, or simply didn't watch part 1, I earlier stated that acquiring stuff off the PlayStation Network story sat beyond my reach, so I never gained access to what seemed rather important to the game itself. 87. Super Mario Galaxy. One of the impetuses behind the construction of this game revolved around the notion of pushing the boundaries of the 3D Mario series farther than it had ever gone before. You could say Super Mario 64 only allowed for the exploration of a castle, and Super Mario Sunshine augmented that aspect by including an entire island to traverse, while Super Mario Galaxy brought that key driving force to a universal level by having its titular hero venture through the cosmos. In spite of the extra space though, this title felt less open than the last 3D Mario game I had previously played, Super Mario 64. For the record, I experienced Sunshine after beating this game. I mention that because one might argue that even though Galaxy felt less freeing than 64, it still loosened some of the restrictions set by Sunshine, and of course because I skipped that title I missed out on how this follow-up improved upon the last generation, so I admit not knowing that fact may have lessened the potential impact I could have had during my first experience with the game. Now without a doubt the presentation of Mario Galaxy comes off as epic, as you see the titular protagonist soar through entire solar systems, which might make you believe that you can go anywhere, when in truth this game creates the illusion of freedom. For example, much in the vein of Mario Sunshine, at the beginning of a level you have to select a specific star to target, and the stage sets a predetermined route you have to take to acquire said star. Now while doing these objectives, some paths will launch Mario through space, but you have virtually no control over him and it will always send you to a specified location, so something that visually looks freeing is actually totally scripted, meaning it's not free. In all fairness, if the game granted you total freedom and exploration, it would probably become too chaotic and you'd mostly get lost trying to find your objective, so in a certain sense it's more linear direction, better maintained order. One reason of why I view Galaxy as more fun than Sunshine regards the return of the flying power-up from 64, albeit no longer under the moniker of the wing cap, but functionally it works the same, so the areas that allowed the use of this item granted more freedom than its predecessor. In all honesty, I just enjoyed goofing off in the Comet Observatory hub world, because it featured this power-up, and likewise due to the intervention of a certain intergalactic princess, you can jump off the structure's edges with no repercussion, since she'll just float you back to safety. On the topic of power-ups, I consider the ones included in Galaxy to be some of the franchise's very best, like the bee mushroom also allowed for temporary flight, the ice flower which permitted Mario to freeze/skate over water, and the boo mushroom transformed the hero into a ghost capable of passing through solid matter. By the way, this also marked the first use of the iconic fire flower in the 3D games. In saying that, for me, this wasn't as momentous an occasion as it would be for some, as I had minimal familiarity with the 2D era of the franchise. My family went with the Sega Genesis over the Super Nintendo during the fourth generation of gaming, and even though I did briefly play Super Mario Bros. 3 on the original Nintendo, I was so young that I only made it a level or two into the game, so I basically had no connection to that era either, so other than the references to Super Mario 64 with the flying ability, some of these callbacks flew over my head. What also helped Galaxy return to the glory of Mario 64 pertained to how, since it focuses on the theme of galaxies, that allowed it to span a wide variety of different types of levels or environments. Like one galaxy might comprise of large gusts of winds blowing you from planet to planet, a different one might resemble a giant beehive that you have to ascend by scaling sticky honeycomb, or another interesting stage consists of giant planetary-sized children's toys. Besides that too, Galaxy still gives you the classic traditional areas like beaches, deserts, haunted houses, or lava worlds, meaning it has a good variety of everything. An element that likely amazed many players, but not so much me, regarded the in-game physics of celestial bodies. For example, most platformers would have gravity that only aimed downwards, while with Mario Galaxy harboring miniature planets you could still feel a force pulling you upwards from underside as well, which meant that you could completely walk around a spherical object just by going forward. Now let me just say I had previously played several Ratchet and Clank titles, and they too had levels that replicated this similar feat, so it didn't seem as groundbreaking or revolutionary to me, even if it may have been more technologically advanced here. Again, I got nothing against this quality, but I had already seen it done before, so it wasn't as mind-blowing. Needless to say though, I did find entertainment in long jumping around the entirety of small planets, something that Ratchet and Clank couldn't previously depict, since it is a game less emphasized movement and platforming, so at least in that sense Galaxy mixed existing things up enough to make it seem like a new spin on an old idea. Now the physics definitely produced some interesting puzzles, something like you ground pound a lump on the bottom side of an object prompting a protrusion to burst out of the top, which as a feature not only helped the game appear more planetary in nature, but also interconnected the environment in a fun way as well. To add in more of my own personal experience into the fray, I'll admit that I technically 100%ed this game, arguably twice, as completing everything with Mario unlocks Luigi, and I subsequently repeated the process for him too. Final thoughts, I view this as a good game, and in spite of how it crafted some excellent moments, because of prior experiences, or in a few cases lack thereof, Super Mario Galaxy never crossed over into the legendary tier for me, since it seemed like many of its best, or more revolutionary ideas had been done before. 86. Ratchet, Deadlocked. First off, for those who don't know, this game does indeed belong to the Ratchet and Clank franchise. It's just that the robot making up the second half of this series title offers more of a support role throughout this game's story instead of his normal sidekick position, hence the omission of his name from the greater title. Gameplay-wise, Deadlocked almost completely deviated from the established formula of the franchise, firstly due to the changing of occupations for the titular Clank, but also in the sense that this game operated more as a series of challenges rather than the standard free-roam 3D platformer. Now, many of the objectives for these missions don't necessarily break away from those of the past, but it presents them in a more linear and less about the aspect of exploration fashion. For instance, much like the earlier games of the series, Deadlocked will feature moments where the protagonist has to battle his way through waves of enemies to reach a certain location, but with the levels of the older installments, they generally included side objectives, like taking the left path will bring you to a racetrack, while the one on the right will direct you to a coliseum, whereas in the case of Deadlocked, it only harbors one path forward with one objective. In a weird way, I appreciate the fact that Deadlocked attempted to take risks and do something new with the series, but I still prefer the old formula. Now I should mention that the story conceived of a good explanation for why it changed directions, as the plot involves an evil media corporation abducting the dual protagonists and forcing them, or should I say, just Ratchet, to compete in various gladiatorial challenges for a sort of reality TV game show. Strictly speaking, since it wrote a decent motive for why it changed, I don't see it as all that bad an issue, plus it didn't shake everything up enough to feel like a betrayal of the franchise. Besides the structural design, the gameplay switched styles too, less emphasizing platforming in favor of combat, partly due to the removal of Clank, who in prior entries of the franchise, assisted Ratchet by acting as a sort of jetpack to increase his jumping capabilities, while also granting him the ability to hover, so without those attributes Deadlock relied less on movement. One manner in how this title focused more on fighting regarded the inclusion of a new spider-like tank vehicle known as the Landstalker, which allowed you to mow down waves of enemies on the battlefield. In addition to that, the replacements for Clank happened to be two combat drones that fought side by side with the player during challenges, so again exchanging a robot suited for platforming in favor of fighting-oriented ones, further embodies the directional shift of Deadlocked from its predecessors. While on this topic, the game changed up the weapon systems as well, namely that they reduced their amount to only 10 of them, which in all honesty I'm fine with, because the prior entry, the third Ratchet and Clank game, kind of ruined the ones they had through upgrades, which to me even tarnished the reputations of some originating from previous installments. Now, even though Deadlocked possesses very few weapons, to counter that sensation the game provided an interesting twist to make the ones they did have seem a bit more filling than they actually are, by applying modifications to them, instead of just the usual upgrade mechanic. For reference, you could now implement status ailments to them, like the freeze mod temporarily paralyzed whoever it hit, or the shock modification could chain damage multiple foes, so again with customization and their varying effects you could argue that it included more than just the base number of 10. Onto some negative qualities. Now, even though I believe the humor improved from the previous game, I still feel that the comedy of Deadlocked could become very annoying or juvenile at times, and what made this worse pertained to how, since this title technically occurs during a game show, you would constantly hear commentators discussing the unfolding situation, thus making it seem inescapable. Next, I have to criticize the fact the game built up a secondary antagonist to potentially have a great climax at the end of the story, only for him to do nothing and disappear. Later entries even suggest that he fell back into crime after what could have been a moment of redemption for himself. Lastly, what may have given Deadlocked an unfair boost in my ratings regarded how it salvaged the series. Now, as you'll see later, Ratchet and Clank happens to be one of my favorite video game franchises, but what you may have noticed by now, I'm no fan of the third installment of this series, this game's predecessor, so because of that I expected Deadlocked to fail as well. But since this title actually alleviated some of my issues with the prior release, I think that unintentionally induced a more positive time while playing the game, if not mentally coerced me to give this title extra credit. Plus, I think a directional shift that actually succeeded worked to its benefit as well, so again I think some underlying sentimental reasons also influenced my scoring too. 85. Asura's Wrath. Unlike many people, I'm not necessarily against cinematically driven games and or the genre of interactive storytelling, in saying that though I rarely ever see value in them, as many times their scripts concern surface-level observations of something like depression or daddy issues, all while pretentiously acting like heavy-handed messages constitute fine art. Now, since much of the gameplay of Asura's Wrath consists of reacting to quick-time events, it technically falls under this classification, but because it avoids many of the weaknesses of its genre and never pretends to be greater than it is, I think it overall succeeds. For starters, Asura's Wrath intends to operate as an interactive anime, and that's what it gives you. Anime is full of epic adrenaline-pumping moments, and what is Asura's Wrath full of? Many epic adrenaline-pumping moments, while many interactive storytelling games feel like they originated from a person who thinks they're smart just because they watched an Ingmar Bergman film or two, and believe that copying his style will automatically make their work high quality too. Essentially, they imitate something outside of their range. On that note, let me just say I'm not calling anime or Asura's Wrath mindless. I actually think it has well above average artistic merit in its own medium. It's just that it doesn't obsess over it to the point of becoming a hindrance. For example, one plotline revolves around the idea of deities offering up the lives of humans to create an energy source to heal the planet, and one among them put his money where his mouth is by allowing his own loved ones to be sacrificed as well, and only use this new power when necessary, while several of the other gods borderline wasted that energy on their own selfish desires. So this narrative revealed how this deity practiced what he preached and never became a hypocrite like his counterparts. In essence, because of his moral code you can find depth in his character, so again Asura's Wrath goes beyond just being a brainless thrill ride. In the action department this game absolutely excels, especially in terms of sheer scope. Like an early fight depicts a boss using the aforementioned energy source to swell up to the size of a planet, and the titular protagonist had to block a meteoric finger of his, plummeting down from the heavens. Even the human-sized battles harbor a grandiose magnitude, where combatants can punch each other to the moon and back while wielding extendable swords that can pierce through the entirety of a planet. Other over-the-top action sequences include on-rail segments where the hero has to shoot down anything from monsters to spaceships, many times while traversing the cosmos. I should mention that about half of the content of this game operates in the style of a third-person beat-em-up, and admittedly the controls often handled a bit clunky and felt rough around the edges, but regardless I still found it enjoyable. This title marketed itself as an interactive anime, and surely enough if you know the medium you'll notice a few references. During a moment of rage the protagonist assumed a form quite reminiscent to Naruto's Four Tails form. At another point the hero performed the iconic Devilman/Gainax pose, while riding at the front of a spacecraft no less, and with this next case I may be reading too deep into a coincidence, but the protagonist defeats an enemy in a fashion quite similar to how Dragon Ball's Broly killed his own father in Movie 8. I feel obligated to mention that, because I'm a bit of a go-to guy for the character in the anime community. On a more humorous note, Azura's Wrath features a comedic hot springs moment, which further cements its resemblance to the medium of anime. I also have to praise this game for its aesthetics. Part of it blends Hindu mythology, a rather unexplored pantheon in video games, with robotics, which results in some incredibly unique character models. Besides the two, this concept allows for some very interesting locations as well, such as battles on the moon or in a void of white nothingness, chasing sequences through mechanical hallways or through space while a supreme deity hurls galaxies at you. In regards to the cast, about half of them seem developed, particularly the battle-oriented ones, while the other lot feel underutilized, again the more tactical ones who prefer to sit on the sidelines. At least for the English dub I can highly applaud the performances of the voice actors. Now the bulk of this title's gameplay revolves around reacting to and timing correctly quick-time events during over-the-top cinematic action scenes. In contrast to most occurrences of this mechanic, if you miss pressing a button at the right time, it generally doesn't impact the story or even the ongoing actions, as their true purpose instead focuses on timing it right to earn points, so in its own way you really could argue it as the definition of a cinematically driven game. Now how your score influences the game pertains to the fact that if you perform well enough on most of the levels, you earn an additional chapter of content that results in the true ending. Needless to say, I only managed to beat the main story. A minor issue I had with the quick-time events regards how they could occasionally pop up at random moments and catch you off guard. Like 3 or 4 times during long cutscenes I actually laid the controller down for a minute or two only for a button prompt to appear and miss it, because I assumed the sequence to just be a normal non-interactive cutscene. While on the topic of the game's movie-like design, I have to say it keeps up the momentum, while preventing it from ever becoming boring, and when it does resort to slower moments it knows when to use them while also not prolonging them longer than need be. I mention that because many other story-driven/interactive games have recently adopted a tendency of forcing you to endure stretched-out unskippable exposition dumps that usually lock you to moving at a snail's pace, which often ruin the pacing, so again Azura's Wrath uses these traits better and in a less intrusive way. 84. The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. For the record, I experienced the Wii U version, so I plan on digging deeper into this breakdown at a later date, but I'll discuss a few thoughts here in the meantime. Now, even though this game may boast a massive map, I find it lackluster in the sense that it failed to establish an identity for its world. For instance, it harbors little variety in terms of enemies, and you can basically find all the types across every region of the map, the only real exception being the sandworms in the desert. As a factor, I find this of great importance because it helps each area develop its own unique identity, as exclusivity, or in this case region locking a foe to a specific area breathes life into it by giving the location a distinct trait. Now some foes come in different colors when encountered under different conditions or climates. On a volcano a lizardman enemy will appear with red skin and breathes fire, while on an icy mountain they will have sky blue scales and possess freeze breath. And to me a palette swap doesn't constitute a new enemy or mean acclimating them to the territory, as they function the exact same way as all the other cases. Sticking with the subject of identity and environment, the game itself struggles to make locations more than just a location. For example, in the tutorial you traverse an icy mountain and later on in a northern territory you venture across another icy territory. Obviously on geographics alone they don't perfectly line up, but they still lack the traits to make them distinct from one another. Like the insertion of the occasional unique structure could have at least given it a little bit of a sense of culture. To give credit where credit is due, I will mention that in the latter area one mountain among a large range has a hole melted through its ridge, which does provide it a little bit of identity, but I still view it as the bare minimal, especially since it can easily go unnoticed. Plus, since Breath of the Wild harbors such a large map, it needs a little more than just a single characteristic to distinguish it from any old generic locale. Tying this into the inhabitants of the setting, I also deem them as having little identity too. which weakens this as an overall fantasy world as well. Like, even though this game includes other races and species, it still rubs off as bare bones or only having the minimal amount. For example, besides average humans, the game really only has 5 other races/tribes, 4 of which represent a dungeon and the 5th serve as the keepers to an important item. So basically, in terms of races within this setting, it feels like this title has nothing beyond the confines of the base story. In contrast, compare that to the residents of Ocarina of Time, where in just the first area alone you meet elves stuck in a perpetual childhood, an ancient talking tree, imps that get along with kids, but despise adults, plant-like businessmen, gossip stones, and at the conclusion you converse with a talking owl. So, in comparison, Breath of the Wild just comes off as lifeless and unimaginative. Again, I repeat that in terms of scale, since this entry absolutely dwarfs its predecessor, you'd expect it to include dozens of more interesting creatures and races, but it somehow includes less. In all fairness, I do have to slightly amend that statement and articulate my point, as in the skies above you can occasionally see a dragon soaring, on the ground you might spot glowing blue bunnies, you can find fairies at shrines, and one single horned stone statue who can talk, haunts a village. In saying that, though, I still view this as below the necessary amount. For example, virtually every Zelda game included fairies, so I still view that as the standard, at least for an entry in this series. Though cool and a worthwhile addition, the dragons can't even communicate, unlike the aforementioned entities from Ocarina of Time, so even viewing them as a race might be argued as a stretch. The same applies to the rabbits, and with the stone statue I guess I'll consider that fair game, but still only one of them exists, so you can even debate the nature of that too. Besides all that, none of these creatures really classify as a tribe, or much less display a sense of culture, the main focal point of this topic. What I think could have redeemed Breath of the Wild would be by letting the Yeti species that debuted in Twilight Princess return in this game, and dedicate a side quest or mini-game to them, as it would have improved the fantasy element, given the second snowy mountain region a little more of an identity, and added an extra race unrelated to the central story to the game. Again, I'll expand upon these elements in a later video. Returning to the lack of variety in enemies, now during the events of this game you'll primarily face 3 different types of enemies, which, to keep everyone on track, I'll just mention their folklore counterparts: goblins, trolls and lizardmen, all of which species virtually wield the same weapons too. Now, even though in appearance they differ, they essentially all function the same way, minus a move or so. Depending on the region, the lizard can spit some elemental substance at you, and the trolls can throw things at you. 2 things I dislike about this: firstly, it makes the combat repetitive, since they all possess the same fighting style, and secondly, these grunt-type adversaries just feel boring to me. For instance, in Ocarina of Time you primarily fought monsters that all operated differently, like the first opponent you face happens to be a snake-like plant that will attempt to bite you. After that, you'll likely face a spider or 2, and subsequently a plant creature will spit seeds at you, now right off the bat. They all function differently, so each battle requires its distinct method to prevail. But in addition to that, the fact you face monsters greatly improves the fantasy of the world, and also prevents a sense of it feeling generic. Just saying this, but to me, frequently resorting to sword-based fighters, like the ones I mentioned for Breath of the Wild, just rubs off as bland. Now, I will say you do encounter more than just these 3 types of foes in Breath of the Wild. Bats, slimes, octopuses, and wizards come to mind, but regardless, the vast majority of battles usually have you facing off against the 3 previously mentioned types. Plus, even if you add up all the enemies in this game, the total amount still pales in comparison to all the other 3D Zelda titles. Now, I understand that the argument that the 3 main foes can switch between swords, spears, bows, or long blades somewhat presents a debate that they should be written off as different types of enemies, but still, since all the variants can alternate between weapons, still leaves an impression that they lack any true differences from each other. With that said, I'm happy about the inclusion of the new overworld bosses. With the Guardian-type foes, I admittedly enjoy fighting them, and I think this title excels at exuding their intimidation factor, but at the same time the concept of fighting robots in a Zelda game still feels blasphemous to me. By the way, I didn't like mechanical creatures in Skyward Sword either, which by the way I rank beneath Breath of the Wild. If anyone mentions this, yes, I know prior Zelda titles featured enemies that fired laser beams, but they at least seemed magically oriented rather than purely scientifically like in Breath of the Wild. Being upfront, I'm not a fan of this game possessing futuristic technology. It feels too sacrilegious to the franchise. In regards to the bosses, I call them mechanically good, but fundamentally bad. Like, I appreciate the game treating their battles more like actual fights rather than puzzles, which I think the past few 3D Zelda titles descended into. But at the same time, all the bosses looked and acted identically, so it felt like they lacked diversity or uniqueness. Speaking of combat, I wish the game would have made the enemies feel more tailored or native to the environment. For reference, in Ocarina of Time, while inside a narrow maze you fought these large spear-wielding foes that would perform these quick lunge charges that could only be dodged if you turned the corner quick enough, so basically their fighting style played to the advantage of the surrounding area. Now I'm not implying Breath of the Wild to be bad in this aspect. For reference, one amusing occurrence involved fighting archers with electric arrows in a flooded plain, meaning that even if they missed the mark, their shock recoil could still electrocute you on account of the water's conductive nature, but regardless, I still wish the developers would have invested more in this subject. Switching gears, I'm not a fan of movement or exploring the lands of this game, as I don't think it features any particularly good way of doing so. Now I'll say that I like the fact that you can ride or tame any random horse, or even a bear found in the wild, but the setting revolves so much around climbing in steep areas that they ultimately feel pointless, as more often or not it would be more expedient to just go up cliffs instead of following a trail. In addition to that, trying to find a steed or renting one from a stable would likely exhaust more time than simply running directly to your destination from the nearest warp point. Now I do like the concept of shield surfing, and at times it can excel as a means of traveling a great distance in a short amount of time, but it only works in hilly areas, plus it can go downhill, but not upwards, which again limits its functionality. In the tutorial, the game presented an interesting idea to cross gaps, where you could cut down a tree and use it as a makeshift bridge, again cool in concept, but after you receive the paraglider at the end of this segment, it quickly becomes the best option, and renders all these creative ideas obsolete. In all honesty, the best option of travel seems to just be to find and ascend the tallest nearby location, and paraglide to whatever spot you wish to go to. With all that said, I like having all these options at my disposal, but it just feels contrived to ever harness them, since they feel like you have to go out of the way to do them. Slightly off topic, but rain can be a major hindrance too, like one of the final tasks I had to perform involved climbing up a wall as fast as I could, and while doing this it began to rain, resulting in my character losing grip and sliding down the cliff, forcing me to delay this challenge. So basically I wasted a fair amount of time traveling to this area and not being able to accomplish said objective. Now I understand Breath of the Wild strives for immersion through realism, but it all too often feels like it gets in the way. Let me just say I came up with this fix before Tears of the Kingdom released and actually remedied this situation, but I'll mention it anyway, and I thought what could have settled this matter would have been being able to acquire an item that prevents you from losing grip in this scenario. I conceived of the spider gloves. For reference, many 3D Zelda titles feature moments where you had to climb up walls or vines, while dodging spider-type enemies. Now that transitions into my next topic, revolving around how this game lacks a sense of progress. For example, after finishing the tutorial you can virtually go anywhere, the only limit being some enemies can off you in a single strike, but if you have the talent or stealth, you can still get around them. Now in the other Zelda games you could only reach some areas after attaining an item, befriending a tribe, or some story event changing the locale. Being upfront, I understand the positives of a totally open sandbox game, but to me they wear off rather quickly and they prevent a more satisfying sense of accomplishment. Likewise, I also have to say that feeling so open kind of makes the experience directionless. Similarly, you can acquire almost every type of weapon from the get-go, which also negates a sense of moving upward or becoming more experienced. Besides that, the quests of the game rub off as borderline pointless too, like since everything has to be available from the beginning, these objectives almost never fulfill a greater purpose, impact the world significantly, or feel multi-layered in regards to cause and effect. Only 2 or 3 side quests come off as having influence on the world, one about building up a yet-to-be-constructed town, and the other involves assisting a tainted dragon. Speaking of quests, I also have to say the main story feels a bit bland too. Of the dungeon-related races, only the fish people had an interesting narrative woven into the plot, being that they can live for hundreds of years, and can remember the pre-apocalypse era and the protagonist's relation to it. With the Desert Amazon tribe, I view their new direction as way less interesting than their Ocarina of Time counterparts, like now they basically just hate men and respect women, at least in the sense of letting them into their town, whereas in Ocarina of Time they borderline had the opposite approach, where they openly kidnapped men to sire the next generation, and they pretty much wanted nothing to do with other women. Again, I found their original motivation infinitely more intriguing and, believe it, crafts a way more rich and developed culture. Realistically, since I wrote a video about this in regards to modern anime, I'll probably sound biased, but Breath of the Wild really strikes me as a game intended for girls. Like the previously mentioned tribe already supports this claim, but in addition to that, the greater emphasis on its rendition of Princess Zelda and her narrative further champions this point. Like, I'll say the playable character of the game more so feels like a witness to her story, rather than the hero of his own. Besides, that her arc revolves around her wanting to study technology, while her father desires her to fulfill the traditional princess role, which I'll just say thematically frequents many series intended for the ladies. Anyway, I'm not necessarily complaining, but I'm just speaking my observations. Likewise with the other main characters of the story, I'll just state that they seemed a bit too archetypal for my taste. On that note, I should say that the game can be very formulaic at times. Instances include all weapons belonging to a set, the enemies following a color-based caste system, and I'll even say the main quests pertaining to the 4 dungeon-based tribes abide by a similar procedure: enter new town, meet elder, given a task, flashback, fight alongside their current-day champion to gain access to dungeon. With that said though, I confess that I highly enjoyed the segments where you have to team up with their champion, as it provides a moment-exclusive type of gameplay, which in turn gives these segments a lot of identity and they generally create more tense and memorable moments. In all honesty, I argue these as the best moments of Breath of the Wild. What I will consider as a strength of this game concerns the fact that all weapons feel balanced, and that none feel significantly better than the other. I say this because many titles that attempt to include different classes of bladed weapons generally have some that don't operate as well as others, so I'll admit that Breath of the Wild did something right that many other games generally get wrong, or at least to a certain extent. To end this off, Breath of the Wild feels like a placeholder game to me, like it sports a massive world that seems empty. Likewise, because it tried to be a bit of everything, it never felt like it established a solid focus or direction, and even this its very name comes off as non-specific too. Like the titles of other Zelda games generally have a namesake item that revolves around a theme: Ocarina of Time, an instrument that helps a hero transcend time, or the Wind Waker, a magical wand that guides the air so the hero can navigate the seas, whereas Breath of the Wild has no titular object. And though you can apply the concept of the wild to some mechanics, camping, gathering resources, dealing with weather, it just feels too broad to tie down any specific subject, so to me I just consider this a large, but directionless game. Anyway, though this took up a lot of time, I still have more to expand upon in my future Wii U video. 83. Devil May Cry. Before I start, I'll say I played this series not by order of release but through in-game timeline continuity, so for those unaware, I had already beaten this game's prequel before going into it. I say that because a common criticism of this title pertains to a confusing subplot with little provided exposition, but in the manner of how I experienced the overarching story, I perfectly understood the occurring events of that situation, which completely negated this potential hindrance for me and substantially improved the experience. While on that note, a negative of playing the franchise in this order stems from a noticeable downgrade in terms of movement and controls, as in these aspects most sequels generally improve upon their predecessor, with this being no exception, but overall this didn't lessen my enjoyment of the game, as after the first hour or two you become used to it. On to the other reason of why I view this as my favorite Devil May Cry entry, or at least among the ones I've played. First off, this game placed a greater emphasis on atmosphere, like its music assumed an ambient, lacking of lyrics tone. To describe it, I'd personally conflate much of the game's early tracks to elevator or church music played in a creepy manner, which meshes well with the setting's mansion-like surroundings. Even though this game lacked as many bosses as its sequels, it put the ones they did have to good use and in interesting or memorable ways that often incorporated the environment into the battle. Like a second encounter with a prior boss, previously fought within a church-like structure, allowed for the rematch to occur inside a curved circular hallway where it started off as a chase sequence with you running from it, which proves that the game doesn't just repeat the same type of battle over and over again. Likewise, another boss who, unbeknownst to the protagonist, reflected much of his history, as well as with his physical identity too, emerged from a mirror, which symbolically foreshadows this revelation later on in the story. Just as with the first mentioned boss, these encounters too differ between rematches. Like the first scuffle occurred in and on an outdoor terrace and balcony with a sunset backdrop, while the final match took place in a dark, nightmarish ballroom, so again, the setting provides its own unique identity for each battle. On a side note, I found a scissor-wielding mini-boss more challenging than any of the game's real bosses. I said this earlier, but I prefer this incarnation of the protagonist to his later more flamboyant self. The initial plan for the first Devil May Cry envisioned it to serve as a new entry in the Resident Evil franchise, which eventually as an idea got canned, but you can still see some of the influence in the design of the game. One instance would be using a similar loading screen to transition to the next room, or it would display a door in front of a black screen opening. Anyway, this quality doesn't necessarily influence my scoring of this title, although maybe one could argue about the pace breaking length of these cutaways, but regardless I still view it as a fun nod to another series from a mutual publisher. Weirdly enough, many common complaints about the game never bothered me in the slightest, like I heard people bash the underwater segments, which in all honesty I kind of enjoyed. Likewise, one of my most utilized weapons happens to be listed as a "don't bothering using" on several walkthroughs. What did weaken the overall experience for me regarded a contrived female supporting character, as it semi-forced an implied romance, tried to insert unnecessary emotions into the plot and its protagonist, and similar to Devil May Cry 3 designed her to be alluring, but neglected to do anything beyond just to tease, so for me at least it just didn't do or add anything interesting to the game. Realistically, I understand that cutscenes shouldn't have all that much of an influence on a video game score, but I nonetheless still find myself thinking about them whenever I hear the title of Devil May Cry. Moments like the hero getting impaled by a blade, only to heal and claim it as his own, the defeats of several bosses, the reassembling of his father's weapon, all while briefly assuming his image after besting his brother, and even the poorly worded, but meme-worthy line of dialogue that attempted to add more symbolic depth to the game. 82. Golden Sun. With the exception of the early Pokemon titles, I believe this might have been the first RPG game I played. Now, commonly with the genre itself, I all too often find that they follow a recurring formula, and that generally after experiencing a few of them, they all start to seem too similar. So in that sense, with Golden Sun being my first, I kind of wonder if I, with my now wider array of knowledge, might hold a different view of it if I played it today, instead of my ignorant decades ago self. Like, I remember this being the first time I experienced a scripted non-game over loss in a video game, which even though I now know other titles did it prior, it as a concept astounded me as a kid. Regardless, I still believe this title crafted enough originality to grant it some identity. For instance, this as a title possessed more than just the regular old turn-based battles of the genre by incorporating many puzzle-solving mechanics into the design of this game, something like moving platforms into a specific formation, so you can jump across them to get over a gap in a room. In its own way, one might argue that it added the Zelda style of gameplay to RPGs. Golden Sun even implements a practice analogous to the Lens of Truth from Ocarina of Time, where in using a special power in certain circular rock formations you can often find invisible secrets. Similarly, the abilities of the protagonist's party also work into the dungeon crawling aspect of the game, like one special will cause unblossomed flowers to sprout vines allowing you to climb certain objects, or another ability operates akin to psychic powers where your character can conjure a giant ethereal hand to move specific obstacles around at a distance, which again adds another layer to the puzzle-solving mechanic of the game. The other strength that assists in developing distinction for Golden Sun pertains to its utilization of the Greek classical elements, earth, fire, water, and wind into the combat, which I kind of consider the best usage among all other cases within its own genre. Of course, it features the standard of all characters/party members being assigned an element, which allows them to perform elemental-based techniques, but where this really stands out regards the cinematic summon-based moves. Temporarily going off on a tangent, throughout the story you find and capture elemental spirits known as Jinn, which bolster the stats of whomever they end up allocated to, or can even be harnessed in battle to perform a special attack. Some of them inflict higher damage than the average blow, others might heal/revive allies, or administer a status ailment to a foe, but anyways, when used as such, that activates a set phase for them, and allows you to perform a summon, and each set phased Jinn per element grants stronger summons, which maxes out at a total of 4. As a reference, a first stage Earth Jinn will basically yield a yellowish energy ball attack, the next one will conjure a gigantic robotic pharaoh to produce earthquakes, with 3 of them a toad-like tree monster will appear, and spit out rapidly growing plants that will launch opponents up in the air, only for them to plummet back down below, and finally the maxed out number of 4 unleashes, Judgment, an aerial knight who from a lion-shaped gauntlet will fire a massive burst of energy, which as a cutscene, depicts it obliterating several lands in the process of destroying the enemy. Anyway, I just believe this to have been one of the best systems for the summoning mechanic across all RPGs, and with how some of their portrayals could feel so over the top made it extra cool. On that note, wielding certain weapons in battle occasionally yielded similar effects, like instead of the generic strike from the attack command, a more cinematic move will occur in its place. One iconic instance depicts a holy-looking blade falling from the sky and onto an enemy opponent. Speaking of combat, I believe the format of Golden Sun has the best traditional battle mode of any turn-based RPG, essentially a mode where encountering an enemy transitions to a different screen in order to fight them. For starters, I innately prefer a front view to a side perspective, as it generally allows for better visibility of the enemy, Plus it usually results in more well-illustrated foes, since the extra space gives the artist more room to work with. I say that because smaller sprite work can often look bad as it cramps too much into one tiny design. At the same time though, I admit that sometimes this perspective can disconnect you from the battle, since the view often isolates the opponent from the playable characters. I'll just say Earthbound comes to mind. Now to counteract this, some RPGs place the protagonists in front of their foe, which does alleviate the issue, but in its own way it creates a new one where it feels like it steals the spotlight from the enemy, who realistically should be the one emphasized during combat. Now the style of Golden Sun remedied both problems with its approach, where it usually positioned the main party off to the right and what they might be fighting against off to the left, which overall provides the best of both worlds, where the playable characters actually seemed engaged with the battle, without blocking sight of the enemies. While on this topic, in dozens of RPG battle modes I feel the various art styles generally clash with each other, which can often break the immersion, like the enemies can rub off as disproportionately sized compared to the background, or even it can feel like the environment, playable characters, and or the enemies come off like they don't belong in the same world due to radically different designs. I remember this bothered me in the previously mentioned Final Fantasy VI a lot. Well, Golden Sun happens to be a case of where everything on screen during battle mode harmonizes well and never clashes with itself. Again, this combined with the last subject stands as why I think Golden Sun has one of the best battle modes across all RPGs. Switching gears, what really intrigued me about this title oddly enough regarded its naming scheme, as many characters possess ones that seemed like they would have been popular in the olden days, but have since fallen to the wayside in the more recent years. For reference, the unaltered name of the protagonist, Isaac, happens to be one I inherently link with the Bible, again something else synonymous with ancient history to me, and in my day-to-day life I have found that to be an uncommon name, which also owes to it feeling less modern, again from my perspective. Now how this ties into my interest of the game revolved around how, since it took place in a medieval fantasy world, and through using old-timey names, that at least from my perspective, cemented the authenticity of this world, or at least strengthened the title's association to its intended image/setting. In terms of world design, I'm not claiming this to be the most creative among its genre, but it did include a fair share of interesting locations and or ideas, such as exploring a talking tree, lighthouses that control the flow of the planet's magic, and even from the fact that a mystical tornado can whisk you away to a strange island governed by a pirate, who acts as an optional superboss. 81. Mortal Kombat 2011. In all honesty, I kinda believe the franchise of Mortal Kombat fell into a downward spiral after the release of the fourth entry, maybe even as early as the third, as it began to overcomplicate itself, and focus on something that wasn't its strong suit, namely an overarching story, and I think this reboot returned it to its glory days, both conceptually, and in terms of storytelling, by keeping everything simple. First though, I need to articulate on the series as a whole. Now with the first few games, one can easily summarize their plots in a sentence or less. Game number 1, a deadly martial arts tournament orchestrated by a shapeshifting wizard. Game 2, turns out the last enemy was only an underling to a greater boss. Game 3, the final boss of the last entry survived and now seeks vengeance. Game 4, a banished elder god has returned from the underworld and desires world domination. So, again, these early entries follow a digestible premise that require little to no background info to understand, but then after that, likely because upping the ante from the last major antagonist couldn't be replicated for the future installments, the later titles greater emphasized plot instead, which just convoluted the story as a whole, as it forced the player to research the advanced lore of the franchise, such as learning about factions, dimensions and realms, different races, as well as the more intricate narratives of the playable characters, so comprehending the occurring situation became more of a task, and needless to say, most likely if you were playing a Mortal Kombat game, you're probably doing it for the sordid pleasure of seeing brutality, and not for the actual plot, which again means it's strayed from its selling point. Not to sound condescending, but its lore and story isn't really all that good or interesting anyway, so that's another knock against the post-Mortal Kombat 4 era. With all that said though, gameplay-wise and through functionality, this era of the series easily trounces its technically better conceived predecessors. Like nowadays, the first three titles feel very bare bones in terms of content, and likewise the fourth entry features a very bland and uninspired cast, so they too have their faults. Getting to the point, this Mortal Kombat, sometimes referred to as Mortal Kombat 9, essentially fixed the issues with the prior eras, and fused their best aspects together. For instance, this game essentially retold and combined the first three Mortal Kombat games into one, which already fixes two issues. Firstly, in that it simplified the story by returning to a less convoluted narrative, And secondly, in that lumping the first 3 games into one prevented the sensation of coming off as bare bones, like it included every playable character from those titles in its roster, so it at least crossed the enough threshold in terms of amount. But besides that, it also managed to incorporate into the story a person who debuted at a later point in the series as well. If you owned the PlayStation 3 version, like myself, you would also find an additional guest fighter in the protagonist from the equally violent God of War franchise. Going off on a bit of a tangent, this crossover blended together way better with the established format of the series than with a previous one, where basically the cast of Mortal Kombat faced the Justice League. Why this inclusion worked, but not its predecessor, revolves around the fact that these two franchises possessed overlapping natures, like Mortal Kombat has you ripping people in half, well so does God of War, meaning their content mixed together better, whereas since the moral codes of superheroes prevent them from becoming too violent, their two franchises innately clashed and felt disingenuous to their source material. So again, Mortal Kombat 2011, or whatever you want to call it, knew what guest characters to include. Returning to the main point, the old Mortal Kombat games rubbed off as bare bones because in terms of single-player content they really only had the arcade mode, while Mortal Kombat 9 included an actual story mode, so it didn't seem as empty even though it essentially retold the events of the first 3 games, so it actually felt like it had meat on its bones. From what you have likely guessed by now, this happens to be my favorite entry in the Mortal Kombat franchise, since it returned to the basics while also retaining the finer details from the more advanced later games that released before this one, but after the original 4. In the more recent years, what has become a more hot-button issue about this game revolved around the many skimpy outfits of the female fighters, which admittedly to a certain extent I even have mixed feelings towards, but not in the way you might think. For starters, I have nothing against fanservice, but I hold this mentality that with material like this, I believe that if you intend on exploring this salacious type of content, you have to go all the way, or else it will seem restrained, if not like actual censorship, which will yield an incoherent product. Like the title itself openly depicts violent acts like decapitations, but for some reason construes the layer of skin beneath the bikini as off limits. Basically, I view it as pretending to be mature when it won't really commit. Quite frankly, I don't think the revealing outfits went far enough, so yeah, I flat out maintain that some of the female fighters would have been better off with less, and that maybe some of the combat damage should have actually stripped them down a little further. On that note, I will praise the designs in one sense, as they do send a message that substantiates their character's identity, like one lady essentially wears nothing but a bikini top and a loincloth, and in her backstory she happens to be thousands of years old and pretty much a deity princess, and I think her choice of attire legitimizes her characterization. For instance, I don't know if it's just me or not, but I've always associated a lack of clothing with godliness or the divine, like the concept of being above human shame, or even susceptibility to weather. Just picture statues of Greek gods. Usually it features them sporting nothing more than just a loincloth too, so from my perspective I think to a certain extent it accurately portrays what many of the characters intend to reflect. So even if I maintain that the outfits seem too middle of the road or censored, I still kind of think they got the job done correctly. Anyway, I overall think that Mortal Kombat 2011 featured the best character designs across the entire series, as it achieved sufficient graphics that place it above the older titles, without ever feeling overly censored like the more recent releases. 80. Golden Sun, The Lost Age. Much of the same experience from the first game, but with that said, Lost Age does improve upon some of those aspects too, ultimately making it my slight favorite of the duo. Most significantly would be how the new summons allowed for the combining of elements, also permitting the consumption of more than 4 set djinns at a time, which culminated in more epic spectacles and the appearances of cool-looking monsters. In all fairness, some of the new summons seemed a bit lackluster, as a few of them just resembled Japanese shrine maidens with an anime aesthetic, basically a bland and repetitive design. But anyway, since the sequel essentially doubled the amount from the first game, it still had enough newly added ones to drown out those I considered bad or uninteresting. Speaking of which, the game itself established a good rationale for why the characters of Golden Sun 1 never attained these mixed element summonings, which revolved around how you learned them from rune tablets usually guarded by a boss-type enemy, so it helped send a message of this feeling like forbidden knowledge, and thus without lessening the standing of the original cast, created a plausible scenario for them never learning said techniques. What also received an upgrade involves the powers that interact with the environment, where a few new inclusions added more elemental-based techniques into the mix, like Parch can evaporate pools of water, or the earthquake-causing tremor which shakes objects off of unstable structures. A mechanic that had been previously utilized by earlier RPGs, now found a home in the Golden Sun series, as this sequel increased the number of available party members from 4 to 8, 2 of each elemental affinity, For the record, only 4 combatants could participate in battle at a time, so with this new inclusion, if you didn't like a specific teammate, you now had the option to exchange them for someone else. Even though the genre had practiced this concept before, it still impressed me, because I had never played an RPG with this feature, so for me at least it seemed revolutionary. Another great aspect of the Lost Age regarded its sense of adventure, and how it permitted greater exploration. For example, in the story, the player gets gifted a ship to navigate the seas, and later on it actually receives a pair of wings to fly around with, i.e. soar over walls that rendered certain areas previously inaccessible. Besides all that, the feature just became fun in and of itself, like parking a ship in a forest, or on top of a mountain just innately rubs off as a cathartic pleasure. Again, I have to mention that at the time of experiencing this title I was still relatively unfamiliar with the genre of RPGs, meaning I had no idea that other series like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy had already included aircrafts or creatures capable of flight, so this aspect would have impressed me more at that age than it would currently. With that said, I reiterate that if I played this game/series now, it might lack that same sense of wonder it originally had for me, so admittedly childhood favoritism likely held sway in my rating of this game. 2 other aspects made the worldly exploration interesting as well. Firstly, the final area of the story goes so far up north that it fails to even register on the map, which really amplifies the sense of adventure and makes this journey seem all the more perilous. Secondly, you could travel to areas out of order, and face enemy bosses severely underleveled. Yes, it wasted time, but it really felt freeing and made the world feel larger in comparison. On that note, I did kind of dislike that the sequel prevented you from returning to the continent of which the first game occurred. I understand why, but it does induce a feeling of restriction in the end. In terms of negatives, it mostly stems from its relation to the prior game, such as a narrative of the former protagonist being misled by evil, which seemed like a betrayal in my eyes. In all fairness, I again reiterate, I played this title as a kid, so maybe I misinterpreted some things and this won't seem as off-putting nowadays as it did in the past. To even put this out there, saying guided by evil might be an overstatement, as the narrative more so concerns abiding by an overly strict dogma. But regardless, I still don't like how it rewrote the former protagonist as being in the wrong and the new one in the right. On a similar note, I quite dislike that the hero of the last story had to play second fiddle to the new protagonist, as it lessens who I perceived as the better character. In the Lost Age's defense, a post-credits sequence reveals that the former lead received a gift that only the main protagonist would likely get in most other stories, so I guess that gives him a bit of a redemption there, but again, that occurs at the end of the actual plot and not in the main game. Another thing that irritated me with this continuation involved how you could transfer some items over from the first game into this one. Now in concept this may seem cool, but it possessed a major flaw, which could prevent you from achieving 100% completion, where to unlock a certain djinn required a totally optional item from the first title, which needless to say I never got, or at least in my first playthrough of the original game. Now this drawback doesn't just stop with that, as the final 2 summons of the game, again I repeat one of the finest aspects of this franchise, could only be attained if you captured every djinn, so basically because I missed an item from Golden Sun 1, that locked me out of what I desired to see the most in 2. Keep in mind this released before YouTube, so I couldn't exactly look up images or videos on the internet either. Anyway, this definitely soured the experience. Anyway, I view the Lost Age as having higher highs than its predecessor, but in turn lower lows as well. But from what you can surmise, these highs outweigh the lows in my book, so I give the nod to this sequel in the end. 79. Resistance 2. Even though I'm not necessarily a fan of the genre of first-person shooters, for some reason or other, I like this game. Admittedly, some of it may stem from personal bias, since the studio that created this title also developed the Ratchet & Clank franchise, which I'm also, or at least used to be, a major fan of. For the record, I haven't played an entry to that series since about 2009, and I'm relatively confident I wouldn't like the direction that it has taken since. Anyways, I digress. Now, in comparison to the rest of its genre, I've just always felt that the Resistance franchise took a more interesting approach to weapons, like one alien munition could fire through solid matter, but as a secondary power could also produce barriers to protect you, a laser rifle that could plant a tracker on your foes which would allow projectiles to pursue them, or a magnum with explosive rounds that you could decide when to detonate. So part of the reason for why I enjoyed this game may pertain to the fact that the weapons possess special attributes that made them feel more unique than others from different games. At the same time, though, I realize other titles of this genre featured similar mechanics, but regardless, I wasn't as fond of them as I was with Resistance. I guess for some inexplicable reason I just feel Resistance did it better. This may stem from just the sound effects, but I also have to say the weapons of this game somehow seemed more powerful than others of this genre. What makes me view this second entry of the Resistance trilogy as the best regarded how it had fantastic setup for most events, boss battles, and cutscenes. I remember one moment involving a battle against a recurring camouflage-type foe, where after entering a new area, the scene began with a teammate of yours suddenly getting torn in half by a briefly visible clawed reptilian monster, and then for the rest of the stage you more had to listen to sounds to find enemies rather than just look with your eyes. A similar encounter involved a swarm of tiny insect opponents moving in a tornado-like fashion that consumed anything in their path, much like the other example you first witnessed them devour a scientist in seconds, and for the remainder of the level, you have to escape their grasp all while fighting back to slow their movements in an effort to make it to the next safe zone. Tying these points together, their presentations not only build up an intimidation factor for these threats, but also hints at the manner of how you will have to approach them, hence why I applauded how Resistance 2 set up for future events. The setting of this title not only depicted a great variety of unique and interesting locations, but also knew how to incorporate them into combat and turn them into a sort of environmental storytelling. Like the previously mentioned chameleon-type enemies primarily appear in a seemingly uninhabited forest of tall trees, which helps induce a tense sensation of feeling watched even though nothing comes off as out of the ordinary, which again blends well with the nature of the opponents. Other well-developed areas include an empty town full of unhatched cocoons, where occasionally a zombie-like enemy might burst out of, or frequently in locales where humanity finds itself heavily on the losing end. The skies above appear as orange-colored, which instinctively signify a hellish world. In one particular case, though, I do think incorporating the environment into the battles worked against it as a game, as it reduced what would have been an epic boss fight into more of just an interactive cutscene. Now, if you haven't played the first Resistance title, this likely wouldn't have bothered you, but since I had, it did, and it revolved around the fact that the game decreased the number of weapons you could carry at a single time to just 2. For reference, the prior game allowed you to hold onto every single acquired armament throughout the story's entirety, and because of that, this aspect rubs off as an unnecessary restriction. Plus, considering how I earlier praised the creativity of the weapons, the idea of limiting their numbers just hampers one of its strongest assets. Speaking personally, I'm more neutral towards this next common criticism, as I understand both sides of the debate, but I'll mention it anyway, and it pertains to the fact that the healing mechanic of Resistance 2 switched from the first game's utilization of medpacks to heal, in favor of automatically recovering from injuries after not taking damage for a while. Again, I see both sides of the argument. Like, one person may hate it because it lessens the challenge of the game, and on the other end I realize that its application actually works in favor of the protagonist's identity, since I'll say he possesses a certain oddity in his genetics, which itself justifies its use. If I had to pick, I guess I prefer the auto-healing. While on the topic of the protagonist, I have to say he comes off as generic. With that said, though, I often find that the case with most playable characters of first-person shooters, so for me it's to be expected. Besides that, except for like one character, the protagonist of Resistance 3 no less, this critique extends to virtually every member of the cast, and I'd go so far to state that none of them really stand out from each other, which with this issue I can't turn the blind eye towards, as in general most games of this genre, even if they might star an uninteresting protagonist, usually have at least a few cool side characters or villains to act as a sort of balance, and since Resistance 2 doesn't have either, I overall view it as a weakness of the game. 78. Hitman Contracts. While playing this game, I initially rated it much higher than I currently do, as it excelled at qualities I value highly, such as atmosphere, mood, and dreamlike cutscenes that make you think, but after researching the lore of its production I stumbled upon facts that I begrudgingly couldn't overlook. For example, about half of its actual content consists of rehashing missions from the first installment of the series, albeit with better aesthetics and quality of life improvements, and in all honesty I actually found those remake levels superior to the new ones introduced in Contracts. Anyways, even though it didn't necessarily hinder my enjoyment or experience with the game, I just kind of lost a little respect for it in the process. In all fairness, I should mention the way in how the plot retold old material beats out the average manner and how most other remakes tell its tale, as the premise of Hitman Contracts occurs after a mission where Agent 47, the protagonist of the franchise, sustained a heavy injury, and in his barely conscious state of mind, he recollects his eliminating of prior targets, which usually somehow tie into the unfolding present-day story events, like after being injected with a syringe by a doctor. He remembers a mission that begins with him using a needle to subdue someone, to start off the next mission. So, yeah, even though this game largely retreads a prior entry, it at least does it in a more creative fashion than most. In addition to that, the plot heavily implies that Agent 47's current state influenced the environment of his memories, like the modern-day events of contracts occurred during a rainy night, and one reimagined mission that originally transpired during the daytime, now takes place at night. Besides providing differences between the remade levels and their counterparts, this quality also gives the game absolutely astounding sense of aesthetic through atmosphere and mood, which I'd personally go so far to call the best in the franchise, even though I don't necessarily consider this entry as the best overall game. Articulating on this topic, the increased amount of darkness really makes light sources stand out in this game. Besides that too, at certain points Hitman Contracts almost exudes the aura of a horror game. Believe it or not, in one level you can find a ghost as an Easter egg. Beyond just the effects of the weather and lighting, the atmosphere finds other ways to excel, like in a hotel stage. A remake of a mission from the first game involved removing much of the original's population, which made the new setting seem disturbingly tranquil. For example, one of the objectives of this area involved eliminating a man swimming in an indoor pool. Now in the first game, many people besides the target inhabited this location, which makes it appear like any normal locale, but Contracts reworked this venue into letting this man simply float alone in this pool, which somehow evokes a sensation that this place feels ominous or even otherworldly due to the seclusion. One major issue I hold against this game revolves around how it tried to appear more mature than it was allowed to be. For instance, one mission takes place in a bondage-themed party that practices cannibalism. Now in terms of violent content, I'll say it lives up to its reputation, but from the more titillating angle, it feels incredibly tame, like the most hardcore that it got was basically just a clothed exotic dance to a guest. Similarly, this fault applies to another mission where the protagonist had to infiltrate a mansion, and to do so involves climbing in through the open window of a room of where a woman happens to be showering. As you might guess, she happens to be clothed, which just kind of makes the scene awkward. Now I'm not insinuating that everything needed to be put on full display, but at least they could have portrayed this moment in a more creative manner, like through suggestive camera angles or during a cutscene have her grab a towel immediately afterwards. So yeah, minor additions like these could have made this moment rub off as more believable or less overtly censored. The next issue pertains to how playing this game the intended way can feel unrewarding. For example, this franchise focuses on stealthily eliminating your targets and leaving as little evidence as possible, so you think if you roused less suspicion during a mission you would receive a greater bonus at its conclusion, but for all intents and purposes you don't. Now if you perfectly complete every objective you earn a reward, which even then only activates during a second run of the story mode. But other than that, there is no difference between completing a mission where you do 99% of everything correctly and one where everything goes awry. So, again, there is little to no incentive to play the game properly, and even with what you could say serves as one, feels rather unimportant in the overall design of Contracts. Another issue with the game regards how, since much of its content exists as random unconnected memories, it doesn't exactly build up to some great event, and likewise with its method of storytelling, the plot doesn't really have a central villain, which further makes it seem unfocused. Being upfront about it, Contracts' place in the franchise feels less of a third entry to the series and more of like a Hitman 2.5. In saying all that though, its final moments serve as a good prelude to its sequel Hitman, Blood Money. 77. Grand Theft Auto 4. In the past I rated this game way higher than I do now. It probably would have been in my top 20, but over the years, I've reflected upon it, and I feel like my initial perception just went with the crowd instead of me forming one for myself. To put it bluntly, a gaming website I used to browse gave this title a perfect score, a feat which on that site hadn't been accomplished for a decade. Prior to this, the last 10 out of 10 would have been Ocarina of Time, and because of that accolade, I personally believe that I overlooked or forgave some legitimate criticisms. Again, not to say I view this as a bad game, I just think it received an artificial boost. For example, despite releasing on a next-gen system, it somehow seems smaller than its predecessor Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas. In terms of exploration, its world contained less map space than its predecessor too. Besides that too, the game halted the mechanic of purchasing assets or new safe houses. Likewise, GTA 4 also abandoned the fun turf warsite feature of San Andreas. Though in all fairness, in terms of story, this aspect would have been hard to implement into the structure of this game, since the protagonist recently emigrated from another country and doesn't really have any ties to gangs, or at least long-lasting ones. In addition to that, 4 dumbed down the recruit a friend mechanic from its prior iteration, where you could only call for backup by literally calling an optional friend for backup, who at max would only send 2 guys to help, whereas in San Andreas, since its lead belonged to a gang, he could literally walk up to nameless members of his group and request their assistance. At max respect level, a total of 7 allies could join up with the player, so the prior game achieved a higher number than that, and its use felt more authentic. As this numerical fourth entry of the series strove for a more realistic approach, it in the process also lost some of the more over-the-top, but fun attributes of the prior games, as it removed weapons like the flamethrower or the Vulcan cannon, or vehicles like the tank, while also limiting aircrafts to just the helicopter. On that note, I'm saying this as an observation rather than as a criticism, as one could argue the more serious tone improved the atmosphere or made the game more unique by separating it out from the rest of the franchise. Admittedly, in some cases of this overall subject, I think a few of these omissions benefited the game, as it occasionally refined a practice or two by trimming the fat or excluded something superfluous. For example, it shed its predecessor's tedious weight gain/muscle mass system, which overcomplicated certain aspects, especially the dating mechanic. Likewise, the greater franchise possessed an infamy for including the occasional overly difficult mission that forced unnatural elements into the series, such as the RC car missions or the rhythm-based dancing minigame of San Andreas, so Grand Theft Auto 4 axing them honestly kind of made me happy. With that said, though, I do feel that after a quarter of the way through the story, many missions started to feel too similar, like several of them followed a plotline of going to some building to make a deal, only for it to be sabotaged, usually by the Russian mob, and you have to fight your way out to escape. And what escalated this uniformity all the more revolved around how the game upgraded to a cover-based system, which made its shooting-based combat all the more indistinguishable, like. With that mechanic, if there's something to hide behind, a battle in an open parking lot with a couple cars becomes virtually the same as one inside a warehouse. Returning to the map from another perspective, one might argue that even though its world harbors less room than its predecessor, it still possessed more content to its locality, since as the story occurred in a city, it filled in nearly every square inch of its environment, whereas since San Andreas devoted a large portion of its map to a desert, it could rub off as empty. Again, that's just another side of this argument. Explaining this aspect thoroughly would stretch out this video longer than need be, but Grand Theft Auto 4 and San Andreas share similar stories and themes, such as narratives pertaining to loyalty, betrayal, police corruption, and scheming antagonists who pull the strings. But in contrast to the last subject, I view 4 as the better written in these mutual aspects, as I'll just say its less indulgent approach yielded a more coherent story. What also makes this game's script excel isn't necessarily what's written down, but sometimes what it doesn't tell you, and you have to read between the lines to hear. For example, one weaselly character desires for the protagonist to eliminate an old friend of his, who he deems untrustworthy, but without giving the direct orders to have him whacked, he instead words it in a way that the protagonist interprets it as such, only for when asked if that's what he wants, he plays it off by saying something along the lines, "That's a bit much, but I think you might be right," which as an act essentially puts the guilt/blame on the protagonist instead of himself. Lastly, even though I've been claiming how it didn't seem as fun as its predecessors, I do have to praise the game for its physics, as I had many enjoyable experiences watching the ragdoll effects of launching myself upwards after firing a rocket launcher at the ground, or from simply jumping out of helicopters mid-flight. Funnily enough, one time I survived falling from max height, because my character collided with a few buildings at the correct angle while falling. 76. Infamous. To start off, I mentally lumped this game into a trio of unrelated, action-oriented, 3D sandbox titles that emphasize movement and climbing up buildings, and among them I view Infamous as the weakest of the trio, but as you will shortly see, they all sit neck and neck with each other, so in the end it's not that devastating a stigma. The two main driving factors of the game revolve around how the protagonist has the power of electricity, and its morality system. As attacks, the electrical abilities come in all forms: regular blasts, explosive electrical grenades, shockwave bursts that push everything back, an electromagnetic shield, and a personal favorite of mine involves conjuring an overpowered lightning bolt from the sky that wipes out anything besides the bosses upon contact. Depending on the player's chosen morality path, some of these skills attain new forms or even allow completely exclusive abilities, like with Good Karma, the shockwave burst will non-lethally float away those caught in the blast, while the evil variant will not only push them backwards, but also electrocute them for additional damage. Beyond their combat capabilities, the protagonist's electrical powers also enhance the movement of the game. He can emit electric thrusters from his hands, permitting him to temporarily float, which besides increasing his long jump distance can also increase the precision of his landings, and in regards to speed, he can use electricity to grind down subway tracks. An element that hinders his powers, but also adds a little challenge to the fighting of foes, revolves around how his body only stores minimal amounts of electricity, and after using it up, he has to recharge either by draining it out of various machines, or in an evil run leech it out of fallen enemies or even random pedestrians. Even though this aspect technically impedes his abilities, I honestly kind of support its inclusion, as it prevents him from spamming overpowered techniques, but also seems like a believable limitation, like an electrical battery eventually runs out of its charge, and since the protagonist basically operates as a living one, him exhausting his supply doesn't seem far-fetched either. In another sense, this aspect creates a sense of progression as the further you advance in the plot, the more electricity you can store, so it indirectly implies the growth of the hero or anti-hero depending on your run. On a side note, the manner in how you boost his storage involves collecting special shards scattered throughout the city. If I haven't said it already, I instinctively enjoy collecting in video games, so that's an added bonus, though I will say in my best playthrough of the game, I found/gathered all, but the very final piece of those shards, and to put it bluntly, getting so close to the finish line, but never fully completing it did irk me a little. The setting of the game occurs in a city that essentially serves as its own world's version of New York City, which in all honesty many open-world sandbox titles use as a base model, but what adds a little spice to the mix involves how it takes place after a disaster, resulting in many broken-down buildings and structures, which helps it stand out a bit more, but besides that it also yields more fun platforming segments. For example, one mission might entail scaling a giant ruined tower, which requires you to climb up severed steel girders or jump along broken pipes sticking out of walls to reach the top. On top of that too, the emphasis on climbing allowed for combat while hanging off the sides of walls, either to keep distance from melee-based opponents or even use it as a shield against long-ranged foes. So again, the setting not only fulfilled a good aesthetic purpose, but also worked into the gameplay as well. In all honesty, with karma systems, in general I'm not a fan of them, and Infamous is no exception either. Personally, I think they really only work if you play as a blank slate type character, and with this title not being that, I just think it comes off as a contrived gimmick. Admittedly, I can get behind it in the sense of influencing the growth of powers, but story-wise it just restrains the plot, like because it has to allow for multiple outcomes per event, that prevents it from finding or crafting the perfect one. Besides that too, it introduces what I generally hate about the superhero genre into the game. Briefly going off on a tangent, Infamous models itself off of comic books, so in a certain sense one might argue that it makes it a more authentic experience, but for me I plain just don't like it. Like again for me with the superhero genre, I basically just want to beat stuff up, and the morality system highly revolves around these less interesting aspects such as handing out supplies or saving people, so that's one reason why I'm not enthralled by it. In comparison to the rest of this unofficial trio, I'll say this game seems the least freeing to play and its movement isn't as fun as the other two, but I will say this wins against them in the department of boss battles, mainly because in terms of length and difficulty it features the best balancing among them, and I do also lean towards calling those belonging to Infamous more creative than those of its counterparts too. 75. Prototype. The middle child of this unofficial trio, in all honesty I strongly considered ranking this as the best among them. But overall, looking back at my time playing the both of them, I think I had a more enjoyable experience with what will ultimately be number one. Now I struggled with this decision because they both happen to have been developed by the same team and even shared the same lead designer, so they basically function similarly. Like in Prototype, one technique involves punching the ground, causing tendrils to pierce the ground from beneath your enemies, thus impaling them, while number one harbors a similar attack that has its own respective protagonist punch the ground, resulting in a ground-based concussive shockwave launching their foes into the air, so again they operate in the same fashion, and really only differ cosmetically. Even the movements of the characters match each other as both can sprint up walls or jump over buildings. I already stated this for Infamous, but both games feature similar styled and infamously difficult boss battles. Beyond that, they even possess near-identical challenge missions, such as within a set timeframe destroy this many of said enemy for a bronze, silver or gold medal, or travel this amount of distance without touching the ground. So, again, these two titles implementing similar types of gameplay stands is why I struggled to decide the better of the two. Now how Prototype breaks away from the number one regards its protagonist, both in terms of personality and what gives him strength. Now all three members of this trilogy either touch upon or at least border on the notion of resembling superhero stories, but Prototype definitely strikes up more of the anti-hero persona than the others, and in doing so it definitely feels the least preachy, which is a positive in my book. For example, even though through the karma system, Infamous created choice-based scenarios to make its protagonist act evil, they aren't necessarily ingrained into the blueprints of its plot, or even crucial outside its intended moment, so in its own way even though it attempted to appear like an anti-hero he really wasn't, whereas in Prototype the story openly builds off the misdeeds of the protagonist. His very actions initiated a doomsday scenario and he really feels no remorse for all the collateral damage done before and during the story, so without a doubt he qualifies as an anti-hero. For the record, I usually prefer anti-heroes over purely good guys, because they happen to be less predictable, plus there is an innate coolness factor in that archetype. I think it partly revolves around the fact that they exhibit a freeing, unrestrained behavior that everyone inherently wishes they could replicate themselves. Besides the personality of the protagonist, his overall appearance illustrates the look of an anti-hero. He wears a hoodie that partially obscures his face, which exudes an ominous aura and sends a message that he conceals something. On top of that, he sports a black leather jacket, an article of clothing synonymous with rebelliousness, which further solidifies him as an edgy character. His powers, which I'll get to in a minute, also support this notion, as his arms generally assume blade-like forms, which itself associates with the danger of an anti-hero, rather than a goody two-shoes protecting superhero. So from both nature and design, I have to say Prototype features the best main character from this triad. What separates this game from the unrevealed member of this set pertains to the powers of their respective protagonists. For reference, in Kombat the latter relies purely on brute strength, whereas Prototype focuses more on special abilities. For instance, its protagonist's signature ability stems from him being able to alter the makeup of his own body, like normally he assumes a human form. But in combat, or just whenever, there's no limitations. For example, if he wants to, he can turn his arms into tools of war, animalistic claws, stony fists to hammer his foes, sniper-like whips that work at a distance, a protective shield, or an incredibly sharp blade-like appendage. As a super move, he can discharge dozens of tendrils from his body to wipe out multiple waves of enemies. Besides that, the powers of the protagonist go beyond just fighting, as he absorbs people to assume their appearance, or even acquire their memories. That actually results in a fun side objective of the story, where at random you occasionally stumble upon a person who knows of the protagonist's past, and you have to consume them to fill up a database to answer the mystery of why this story transpired. Funnily enough, in one of my playthroughs of Prototype, when I finally found the last person for this web of intrigue database, they just took a missile to the face, thus technically killing them. But luckily enough, I caught them mid-air, and was able to absorb them and acquire their memories before they registered as deceased. So just by a thread I managed to complete this side quest. As previously stated, the hero of this game can sprint up if not jump over entire buildings, and that quality of movement makes Prototype a joy to play, as just the freedom of being able to move around like that alone creates entertainment beyond the plot. Similar to Infamous, the setting of Prototype mimics a post-disaster New York City, except under a different calamity, where a virus has converted dozens of buildings into fleshy mountains and has turned many humans into monstrous creatures. Now, even though I feel that this catastrophe provided the world a little identity, I don't think it achieved the same locational heights as, say, Infamous. To put it bluntly, I view the latter as more recognizable and distinct than Prototype. Again, I'm not claiming it as bad, but it just lacks the style or flair of Infamous. Among this trio, this entry harbors the worst boss battles. In all honesty, I view them as the worst part of the game, as they rub off as too overpowered and it forces you to rely on cheap tactics to win, and on top of all that, your blows usually inflict only minimal amounts of damage, which drags on these poorly conceived moments longer than need be. I should also mention that at the beginning, or at least before you attain certain power-ups, some middle-of-the-road enemies can come across as overpowered too. So with that said, I guess you could say the combat feels a bit unbalanced. Other than the boss battles, I still view Prototype as a fun to goof around in game. With that said, on to the final member of this trio. 74. The Incredible Hulk, Ultimate Destruction. Normally I'm not even a fan of superheroes, let alone their video games, but with this case I'll make an exception. A good way to describe this game would be by calling it a what-if scenario where the Incredible Hulk was inserted into the setting of Grand Theft Auto, and needless to say this produced what I view as a playground power fantasy, as you primarily lurk around an open-world city, while playing as an unfettered entity capable of jumping over buildings, running up walls and lifting up cars over his head, which basically grants you almost total freedom of movement. How this quality stands out regards the fact that most open-world games heavily emphasize action on the ground level, while this game with the special abilities of the Hulk focus just as much on the tops of buildings, which feels even more freeing, since not even the skies feel off limits. The raw power of playing as the Hulk definitely proves itself a great power fantasy too, like he can move at speeds allowing him to run up the sides of buildings. With his might he can rip cars and other mechanical devices in half, and crush them into gauntlets to inflict more damage on his foes, and briefly charging his strength permits him to create shockwave attacks, such as slamming his hands into the ground so intensively that it blows everything near him back. Beyond just the power fantasy aspect of the Hulk's might, his actual techniques rub off as cool too. He can snatch missiles directly out of their launchers and throw them as projectiles. He can jump up into the air and grab aircrafts, causing them to crash, or crush vehicles to use them as shields or even as a skateboard to ride around the city. Now these two qualities indirectly create possibly my biggest grievance with the game, as when the Hulk faces enemies that can match him blow for blow, namely the bosses, you, the player, lose that cathartic sense of raw power, since they force the Hulk to fight on the back foot. Besides that too, the bosses seemed so overpowered that their fights continued on for too long, which also took a bit of the fun out of them. Something that many might see as a flaw, but doesn't really bother me, revolves around the fact that the setting only possesses two real maps, a city and a desert. I say real, because there is a sort of hub world, a church/laboratory that acts as a shelter for the Hulk, but it would be disingenuous to call it an additional sandbox type level. Now, since the areas themselves cover a vast distance and even include variety, the desert has a small town and military base within its range, I don't perceive the setting/environment as all that lacking. One thing that I think makes a game about the Hulk more tolerable for me than other superhero titles regards how it doesn't try to be deeper than what it is. Like many other superheroes will push a message like, but if I harm the villain then I'm no better than him, whereas since destruction drives the Hulk, he has no such pretentious or pedantic thoughts. At the same time though, it doesn't exactly feel mindless, as the plot plays up a narrative that even though he often saves the day, his governmental foes will rewrite the story to make him into a criminal that caused everything bad to occur. Just to better detail my experience, I played both the GameCube and PlayStation 2 versions, and for some reason that I can't put my finger on, I preferred the former variant. To summarize Hulk, Ultimate Destruction, it's a fun cathartic game where the world itself becomes your playground. 73. Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. I've played 5 entries in this franchise, and even though I view this one as only the second best, I still call this one the most polished or refined, though maybe not in the voice acting department. But in all fairness, some overemphasized lines of dialogue in its own way kind of give this game a certain charm. Though this alteration may not be everyone's cup of tea, but for me at least, I say it molded the gameplay into something that I favor over its predecessors. For example, the earlier titles followed the, in my opinion, repetitive pattern of World 1-1, 1-2, and so on, but Symphony of the Night reworked that framework into a style more akin to Metroid, basically a 2D platforming adventure game, which allowed you to more freely explore the game's map, which essentially comprises of Dracula's castle and some of the surrounding land. Even though this game grants the player more freedom, it doesn't totally throw them blindly into the darkness, as it obeys a structure to slowly ease them into the world without unintentionally confusing or overwhelming them, like you won't accidentally stumble into the domain of an overpowered boss until you're pretty much ready to face them. One manner in how Symphony of the Night accomplished this feat involved gradually unlocking new abilities as you progress through the story, usually by collecting an object after defeating a boss. For example, the mist form allowed you to phase through certain obstacles, or the bat transformation permitted you to fly, so you could reach previously inaccessible areas. Even this, the alternate forms themselves could gain new techniques as well, like the bat form could acquire the ability to let you see in the dark, which further opened up the world for exploration. Likewise, the element of exploration allowed for a greater emphasis on two of my favorite aspects in gaming, through collectibles and filling up an empty map. Like, because you could return to prior areas, you could go back and examine old locations in new ways, and might find some weapon or item in the process. On that note, I instinctively enjoy when video games portray unexplored areas as gray on the map, and when you finally survey every nook and cranny they get colored in, as it really does emphasize the exploration in adventure games. Besides that, it's just a guilty pleasure of a feature that I like, which for me bumped this title up a notch. With the rest of the Castlevania series, what always kind of left me at arm's length regarded how infamously hard their stages could be, but this entry semi-rectified this issue as it introduced a leveling up mechanic, and also allowed you to customize your character's gear. So if, let's just say, you struggled against a certain boss or enemy, you could find ways to make them easier, like leveling up would simply improve your stats, and certain gear nullified elemental attacks, like a strategy to beat a hidden, electrical-themed superboss, involved equipping an item that completely nullified its affects. With that, I also have to say it provides the benefits of both worlds, like if you find Symphony of the Night too difficult, there's way of alleviating its symptoms, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you desire a challenge, it doesn't force you to take the easy way out. As this happened to be the first Castlevania game I sunk my teeth into, one factor that impressed the longtime fans, but went moot on me regarded how it evoked nostalgia, such as how much of the map, again Dracula's castle, resembled the levels of the earlier titles, which technically took place in these same halls, or another aspect involved how characters from prior games reappeared in some way or another. For example, Alucard, the protagonist of Symphony of the Night, debuted in this franchise originally as a companion role in Castlevania 3, and in this story, where he assumes the leading role, he has to face fake versions of some of his old friends from the prior entry. Similarly, this game picks up after the last installment of the series, where in its tutorial, it actually reenacts the battle against the previous final boss, before handing off the reins to Alucard. Now, even though at the time, the references to the past left no bearing on my scoring, when I finally got around to playing some of them, it did elevate my opinion of Symphony of the Night. On that note, some longtime fans expressed disdain for how this entry broke away from the franchise's iconic usage of a whip as the weapon for the hero, and instead opted for its protagonist to wield a sword in its place. Again, as I had no prior connection to the series, this change didn't bother me, and I actually favored the latter over the former when I tried out the earlier titles. In general, with this franchise, the games aren't exactly story-driven. Most of them follow the premise of, go defeat Dracula, and Symphony of the Night was no exception, but it had the occasional really good moment to make it more memorable than the other ones, such as how a fight against a succubus involved the creature impersonating Alucard's deceased mother to toy with his emotions, or how after the protagonist defeated Dracula, they had a very well-written conversation together. Again, I'm not pretending this to be a narrative masterpiece, but at least by Castlevania standards, Symphony of the Night rises above the other installments. Overall, I have to say Symphony of the Night felt like a Castlevania game, maybe even just a 2D game in general, tailored more to the interests of a guy like me, and that's why I rate it relatively high. 72. Uncharted 2, Among Thieves. With Uncharted 2, I've always had a weird relationship with it, or maybe I should more so say with its perception, since that's what technically influenced how I approach reviews of this game. Like when this PlayStation 3 classic first released, everyone acted astounded by its near cinematic feats, many even hailing it as one of the finest video games ever made, which needless to say I strongly disagree with, but oddly enough, when I believed someone over-criticized the game, or even just its franchise in general, I always proverbially came to its defense, so in a strange way I had a bizarre loyalty to a title I considered overrated. What also supplements this stance regards how when it did something right, it usually executed it very well, while when it made a poor decision, it did so in a borderline idiotic fashion. Again, I also kind of apply this to the franchise's entirety as well. For instance, I'll call certain segments downright astounding, such as the multi-chapter long train car ride where to reach the vehicle's head end, you had to fight your way through dozens of boxcars full of mercenary soldiers, dodge environmental hazards, like low clearance bridges while scaling the roof, and even survive a run-in with a helicopter. So yeah, as an action sequence, this moment absolutely excels. In addition to that, the sheer variety of locale covered by this single excursion impressed me too, as it transitioned from a jungle into a tunnel system, and concluded with an uphill ride to reach the top of a snowy mountain, where the game's story technically began during the prologue. For reference, the first half of Uncharted 2 starts off as a flashback sequence where the protagonist remembers the events that led up to this situation. At the same time though, the first true level of the game, a museum heist, was an awkward, monotonous, pace-ruining, stealth mission that somehow feels too open-ended yet excessively scripted. Besides that, I'll say most of the time the combat could be extremely satisfying. I personally enjoyed the stealth-based takedown where if while climbing you encountered an absent-minded man standing directly next to a ledge, you could grab him from below and pull him down to his doom, in saying all that at certain points the game implemented unignorably bad moments. Like later on in the story, you encounter a bullet sponge type enemy that could withstand several minutes of abuse from the most advanced military hardware, but then a single arrow from a crossbow could bring it down in one hit, which for me just breaks the immersion. The final clash against the game's antagonist felt off too, not to go too deep into spoiler territory, but it involves running away from and dodging attacks from a superhuman all while detonating exploding tree sap to bring him down. Now realistically, I think the developers of this game achieved as much of what they could have in this battle, but I just believe Uncharted 2, and its franchise for that matter, innately struggle in the department of boss fights, because its combat system, especially with its choice of weaponry, better suits itself to warding off multiple enemies at one time rather than just facing one singular foe, so I just think Uncharted 2 performed decently at something predestined to fail. Speaking of which, a frequent insult commonly hurled at PlayStation and or Sony regards how their exclusive titles shifted away from actual gaming and assumed a more movie-like presentation, and I can definitely see that practice beginning here, like a greater reliance on cutscenes and over-the-top action sequences, which to be fair in its day, much of the sheer feats of what Uncharted 2 accomplished served as a massive breakthrough for what modern gaming consoles could achieve, but in becoming more cinematic, I kind of think it embraced a lot of negative aspects of blockbuster films as well, like many lines could seem a bit too cringe, or how certain characters and their roles felt archetypal or like tropes, such as two obligatory female characters, or one of them, the tan-skinned Black-haired one represents a chaotic fun, while the other, who sports blonde hair and dons light-colored clothing, both of which symbolize purity, embodies the typecast role of a boring, but moral, voice of reason. In all fairness, at the time these qualities didn't exactly bother me all that much, but now it does, and it just makes the game feel a bit generic to me. A minor gripe of mine that will likely not trouble most, but still affects me, regards how a favorite character of mine, Victor Sullivan, the womanizing mentor to the protagonist, had barely any presence at all in Among Thieves. Now yes, I acknowledge many might not even care about his absence, but regardless, I do think you can make an argument for how certain characters can feel underutilized. From a technical standpoint, I do need to praise the game's controls, as after I beat this entry in the series, I later followed up by giving its predecessor a try, which needless to say handled nowhere near as well as this continuation. On another note, in general I've never really cared for playing online multiplayer, but for some reason or other, likely to collect trophies for my PlayStation Network account, I somehow dedicated a surprising amount of time playing Uncharted 2 multiplayer. I'm fairly certain I spent more time using that feature on this game more than any other. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but I really enjoyed the climbing in this game, as on many occasions it really let you go up noticeably high, which for its day was definitely an accomplishment. But besides that, even what you could climb up was cool as well, such as giant monuments, a few of which served as puzzles, or just even to act as a way around blocked paths. So again, I reiterate, Uncharted 2 usually had fun gameplay. 71. Chrono Trigger. Normally I prefer to play games on their systems of origin, but what accompanied this release nullifies a rather nitpicky criticism of mine, so I'll make an exception, plus not to mention the fact that I did not even realize this debuted on the Super Nintendo when I first played it, so there's that too. Onto my nitpicky criticism. Now, anytime I've heard someone review Chrono Trigger, they always have to mention and praise how Akira Toriyama, the man behind Dragon Ball, illustrated the character models for the cast, but in all honesty I've always found that an irrelevant commendation, since other than the box art of the game and profile pictures appearing under certain screens of the main menu, his artwork doesn't really appear in-game, as it instead relies on sprite-based pictures, which, even though it may adapt his original designs in its own image, it still feels a bit disingenuous as a sort of praise. But with the version that released on the DS, I can finally treat this accolade as legitimate, since it now included animated cutscenes that accurately portrayed and incorporated his original vision of the characters into the game. Again, I admit this may sound incredibly nitpicky, but this is always something that comes to mind when I hear Chrono Trigger. Onto the content of the game itself. Now, with many JRPGs on the Super Nintendo, I criticized them for often lacking in identity, but this one absolutely dodges that negative trait and establishes itself a strong selfhood, which also separates from many of the recurring trends of the time. For example, the bulk of this genre either follow plots about rebelling against the evil empire or quests about defeating a dark lord, whereas the story of Chrono Trigger revolves around traveling throughout the various epochs of time to prevent an alien parasite from reviving and initiating the apocalypse. To be fair, I must admit a few individual narratives feature these tropes, but they don't represent the entire story, and in most cases the game uses these qualities to set up for something more complex. Like in one time period you do have to fight a Dark Lord type of enemy, but that more so serves as a setup to an ancient magical kingdom, which covered what triggered the true antagonist's revival. This ventures somewhat into spoiler territory, but after this arc the story itself intends for you to interpret him more as a misunderstood antagonist rather than as the Dark Lord archetype, so even then Chrono Trigger still didn't fully abide by the standard trope. Even this, depending on some choices in the game, this character may actually end up an ally to your party later in the story. The time periods you can explore consist of the Caveman era, the Middle Ages, the present, a post-apocalyptic future, and even a world outside of time itself. As an inclusion, this adds much depth and identity to the game, such as possessing a diverse group of recruitable party members. For instance, it has a futuristic robot, a medieval knight cursed to resemble a frog, and an attractive cave woman. Besides the characters, the various time periods also affect the side quests of the game. Like, one mission has the party restore a rather barren land into a lush forest, which involves convincing a woman from the past into planting a tree, leaving your unaging robotic companion from the future there to tend to them for the upcoming centuries, and returning to the present to retrieve him, as well as witnessing how your actions resuscitated the area. So yeah, many of these quests take full advantage of the time travel mechanic. Likewise, the party members all have their own individual character arc within the story, such as following the Frog Knight as he attains the legendary sword of his kingdom. What also left an impression on me regarded its final boss. For spoilers I'll keep this at a minimal, but I particularly liked the concept behind its second and third form, one of which reminds me of the character of Cell from Dragon Ball Z, again the Toriyama influence at play. On that note, what also makes this game interesting regards how you can technically face and defeat the final boss whenever you want to, meaning you can skip most of the main story if you desire, which also by the way allows for a sort of challenge mode where you can battle him underleveled and test your skills. To account for this feature, Chrono Trigger wrote several different endings depending on what point of the story you beat the final boss at, like at certain points some party members leave the group, which can also affect the outcome. Admittedly, most of these endings may not be all that profound, but as an inclusion I still view it as cool nonetheless. I also have to praise this game's soundtrack, and even though I played it on the Nintendo DS, at heart I still view it as a Super Nintendo title. I'd personally call it the second best sounding one on the system, since I played this game on the DS. I should also mention how this version featured extra content. Admittedly, some of it just felt like pointless filler. Climb up this tedious hill in the present, then climb up that same tedious hill in the caveman era, and finally climb up that hill again in a later period to see what has been added since. So yeah, that one rubbed off as repetitive, but the more interesting addition introduced a new super boss enemy, known as the Dream Devourer, which functioned as a plot device to connect this game to its PlayStation released sequel Chrono Cross, so this one enhanced not only itself, but its own series as well. 70. Super Smash Bros. To start off, I recently had a change of heart with this game, as a few years back I uploaded a video called, Why Fighting Games Never Satisfy You, and in that, I stated that in comparison to future installments of this series, Smash Bros. 64 felt empty after experiencing the later entries, because of its relatively small roster and from the fact that it lacked the trophy feature. But after watching some friends play this game, I had some of the most pleasant moments I'd had in years watching someone else play video games, which made me remember how great the multiplayer of this game was, and it sparked me to think about the other great elements of this classic. For example, all stages feature an exclusive mechanic to make them feel unique from each other. Donkey Kong's has a rotating barrel floating underneath the arena, that if after a ring out you accidentally fall into, gives you a potential chance of being propelled back into the ring to continue fighting again without losing a life, or the Kirby one features a tree that can blow you off the side. I view this quality as important, because many later Smash Bros. Games harbor stages with identically designed foregrounds, but with different backdrops that have no impact on gameplay, so basically even if they may look different, they functionally work as if they were the exact same. Likewise, I feel that the original stages perfectly represent their respective franchises without having to overcomplicate things. With many recent levels in newer Smash Bros. Games, they basically just feel like you're riding a plane that constantly has to make stops to show various locations or landmarks, interrupting gameplay in the process. In some cases it comes off more like you're trying to survive the stage instead of actually playing against an opponent. For example, after the first time I beat Smash 4's single player, I had the chance to unlock the Star Fox character of Falco, and in the arena to do so, which at first starts off as riding on top of spacecrafts, the floor suddenly disappeared, leading me to fall below, and to think to myself that I'm about to lose/miss out on this character, because of a mid-battle stage transition. Luckily I landed on another craft and could continue with the battle, but that moment made me realize how these complex stages actually pale in comparison to their older and simpler counterparts. In regards to the roster of Smash Bros. On the N64, even though it may be meager in number, they all felt unique and deserving of being in the game. The only exception would be the unlockable Jigglypuff, but even then, it fulfills the role of the obligatory joke character that for some reason all fighting games unofficially require. To say this too, even though Classic Mode, or what's referred to as one-player mode, features a small cast of characters to work with, it still added some idiosyncrasies to make it interesting. 3-player team match against Giant Donkey Kong, fight every color of Yoshi, or battle against every absorbable form of Kirby, and also a match against Metal Mario. Beyond all that, what adds a lot of charm to the game regards how it masterfully used audio and sound effects. Now I'm not insinuating the others to be bad, but I kind of feel that the later Smash Bros. Games assuming more epic and orchestral music for their character select screen rubs off as a bit too much, whereas 64's sounding like something you would hear in a show about gambling gives it a lot of charm. Likewise, Captain Falcon's iconic and meme-worthy line of Falcon Punch didn't originate from his home series of F-Zero, but Smash Bros. 64, which goes to show how this title made good choices in the sound effects department. Even the random noises made by items or moves carry distinctness as well. Fox's laser, the chimes you hear during the platform minigame, or the sound played when you destroy a target. Final thoughts: if judging this game solely on sheer amount of content, it may feel lacking, but in terms of design it's a near masterpiece. 69. Ratchet and Clank Future, A Crack in Time. I'm a big fan of this franchise during the PlayStation 2 era, but after its conclusion on that system I kind of felt that this series fell off in quality, in saying that though despite a crack in time releasing on the PlayStation 3, the downfall era, I still view it as a worthwhile entry in the series. First off though I must admit that it did succumb to some of the issues that partially brought down this franchise, like a drop in quality, and its charm stemmed from the fact that the newer games shed the subtle adult and innuendo-driven sense of humor of its past, and exchanged it for more childish and family-friendly content. Just as an example, look at the titles, PlayStation 2 era, Going Commando or Up Your Arsenal, whereas with the PlayStation 3 generation, otherwise referred to as the Future Saga, Tools of Destruction and A Crack in Time. To be fair, the download-only title of Quest for Booty works as a double entendre, but admittedly I never played it since it didn't release on disc in my country, so I can't confirm if its humor infantilized as well. Now if you notice, the earlier titles operate as puns, as they both play up militaristic concepts, but also function as slang. The first one means not wearing underwear and the other sounds quite similar to the British pronunciation of an expletive, whereas the PlayStation 3 games and later had no such disguised meaning. So to say this, I think the difference in the naming scheme of the titles reflects this less fun direction. Getting to the actual game, one way in how I thought its humor deteriorated regarded how it reduced an existing character who could be described as a goofy con man to a pathetic man-child, which for me just removed his initial charm and made him seem more annoying. Besides that, A Crack in Time marked the return of a former antagonist known as Dr. Nefarious. Now even though I like his design and color scheme, I just found him and his antics too immature in comparison to some menacing prior villains. Essentially he comes off as a wacky racist type of adversary. Besides that, just bringing back someone who I considered a lesser antagonist puts a blemish on the game. On to some of the positives. Now I particularly enjoyed the sections where you played as Clank, because many of them had an excellent aesthetic, but besides him acquiring a limited control over time allowed for some fun and mentally stimulating platforming and puzzle segments. On top of that, once the titular duo reunited, the latter still retained his newfound abilities, so that came as an added bonus, since I thought you would inevitably lose them. On another note, I also maintain that the weapons of A Crack in Time are some of the best in the franchise, maybe not on par with Going Commando, but I still see them as great and way more memorable than those of other entries in the series. Two of my favorites happen to be the Rift Inducer, which would open a black hole and have a tentacle monster pull enemies inside, and the other would be the fan-submitted Spiral of Death, which fired buzzsaws that would boomerang back to its launcher. Probably the greatest strength of this game would be its story. Now I should say it technically retconned the past, as it rewrote the identity of Ratchet so that he was the last of his species, which couldn't be true since in a prior title he encountered a female character that looks to belong to the same race as him. Now even though I'm not fond of newer games changing their history, I'm a bit more tolerant of it here, since the inclusion of the word future onto the title makes it easier for me to mentally separate the two eras into different series. Plus, since I enjoyed its overall narrative, I'm a bit more forgiving of its retcons. Lastly, what elevates this game up a notch for me regards how it features a good thematic message of not being chained to destiny, and that you can be your own person regardless of pre-existing connections. Like Ratchet didn't have to abandon himself for his own species, and Clank didn't have to assume the role his creator designed him for, so again a good theme that fits the narrative of the game. For reference, since they both revolve around the concept of time, definitely ups my respect for this title. 68. Fatal Frame, Maiden of Blackwater. As I intend to address and defend a controversy tied to this game in a separate video, one that actually syncs up with what I just mentioned about Mortal Kombat, I'll only briefly discuss this topic for this video, but regardless I still got other stuff to articulate on, some that will better work here than over there. Now, the frequently uttered criticism about this game regards how this horror title deviated from tradition by portraying ghostly ladies in a rather seductive and curvaceous fashion. On a cursory level, I like the fact that this game bucks the horror trend of depicting spectral women in a more grotesque and putrid style, as I think this practice gives Maiden of Blackwater a little identity to separate itself out from its spooky compatriots. Understandably, I realize why the genre opts for more freakish appearances for females instead of ones of beauty, as under most circumstances a creepy look better disturbs or gets underneath one's skin than say something attractive. Essentially the mood which works of horror usually strive for. In saying that, though, the story itself establishes a strong rationale for why it explored such an avenue to justify its implementation, as a signature plot point involves men being lured to their deaths by apparitions for a ritualistic ceremony, and in this scenario the standard issue ugly appearance for ghost women would likely repel rather than attract. So to function properly, the narrative needs something that can tempt a man, which again pretty much requires an outwardly beautiful look, and, by the way, in the eyes of most, a busty figure would further amplify the allure. so that increasingly substantiates its inclusion. Likewise, otherworldly women with overtly feminine curves ties into the story in another way, where among the trio of protagonists, the male lead due to a traumatic memory gets unnerved by feminine ladies. In fact, the only girl who he can feel comfortable around possesses a very androgynous look. At one point she actually gets mistaken for a boy by the supernatural. So in the context of the story, having ghosts frequently appear as busty and hyper-feminine works, since traits like those would likely frighten the male protagonist more than the grotesque normal style. On the flip side, I must acknowledge that with works of horror, especially among those of the slasher subgenre, they generally have no qualms with depicting living women as attractive, so in this regard Maiden of Black Water doesn't exactly subvert the standard mold with its alluring female leads who quite often might be construed as underdressed. With that said, though, the story provides a reasonable excuse for their choice of design. Not to dive into spoiler territory, but the female ghosts of this universe don't perpetually exist, so they require a new generation to assume their roles, so again the beauty of the female protagonists need to rival those haunting them. Likewise, one of the protagonist trio happens to be a model, an occupation synonymous with beauty, at least with most cases, and the story puts this aspect to good use, once again as a subversion, as the combat mechanics of the greater Fatal Frame franchise revolves around taking photographs to exorcise ghosts. And with this fifth installment, one could argue that thematically a camera gets used against the model protagonist. I'll just say she deals with self-hatred, and for her, posing for photographs represents a way of debasing what she dislikes about herself. Anyways, Maiden of Black Water substantiates a strong foundation, both in terms of plot and theme, for its use of what might be considered as objectifying content, which further acts as a reason for why I see value in this title. Next, this following topic semi-coincides with the last, but I view it as different enough to merit a mention, and it pertains to a cool effect in the game, where when a character gets attacked by a ghost their clothing ends up drenched and becomes transparent, which for the ladies exposes their undergarments. For the record, some critics perceived this aspect to be another case of objectification. Once more I defend the inclusion of this trait, as on a surface level I view it as a neat and immersive effect, but I also wager it is another good use of tying the themes of the game into the story. For instance, since the ghosts of this game strongly associate with water, hence the title Maiden of Black Water, the idea of the protagonists getting soaked serves as a sound way of symbolically representing the paranormal world ensnaring them, likewise with their clothing becoming more see-through, thus exposing their normally concealed skin and fabric underneath signifies a visual metaphor of their vulnerability, as it embodies losing a layer of defense. So once more I have to praise this game's use of themes. To be fair, I should mention that in a few circumstances overemphasizing symbolism and depth may have actually hindered gameplay, like to induce an unsafe feeling of paranoia and fear. Sometimes when picking up an item, a ghostly hand might randomly unexpectedly grab the player, forcing them to fight it off in a button mashing segment, again thematically a genius idea, but it occurs so frequently that it just becomes annoying and quickly loses its potency since you come to expect it. Another time involves landing the final blow on a boss. Now in story, the protagonists have a sort of psychic power of being able to witness the final living moments of an exorcised ghost if they touch them before fading away. Again, a cool idea that serves as an interesting way of exploring lore, but against one specific boss this becomes a nightmare, as after a long grueling battle, or I guess photoshoot, you finish them off by touching them from a specific position, which in all honesty can be a hard place to pinpoint, and if you fail to make it in time they regenerate their health. And needless to say, the difficulty of this demotivated me from attempts at unlocking the second ending, because of how much of a pain it became to find the correct position to finish them off. Sticking with listing off my grievances, I do need to say that the story itself felt like a less interesting rehash of Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly, a title I had previously played and to this day consider is far better. On that note, I also think that the plot harboring two separate antagonists overcomplicated the story, and it would have been better if their narratives combined into one singular entity instead. Next, I also felt the game relied too much on Japanese horror tropes, dolls and puppets for instance, which often seemed contrived. With that said though, I must admit they yielded cool environments and locations, but regardless they could still feel out of place. What somewhat spawns off of that last point regards how certain elements could make the story a little too predictable, like on title alone you can pretty much guess who the antagonist of the story will be, and speaking for myself I pretty much predicted the main narrative twist after the first few cutscenes. With that said though, I find the horror genre predictable in general, so I don't hold it too greatly against this game. One aspect that irked longtime fans of the series, but personally didn't bother me, involved how the story rewrote the nature of a former protagonist in a way that made them seem mentally frail and dependent on others, which tarnished their legacy. Now for me, I never played their entry, As of now I've only completed installments 2 and 5, so for me I have no connection to their original character, so if this new narrative clashes with their former characterization I wouldn't know. But anyways, even if it holds no sway over my opinion, I felt obligated to mention it regardless. Comparably, many have also complained about the backtracking of the game, which I do believe holds some truth, but I don't consider it as bad as many made it out to be. Like many times, the starting point of the next chapter of the story would begin in the penultimate area of the last one, so it could feel a little tedious, but it beats starting from square one every time. A final positive quality worthy of praise involves how the game could play tricks on you, the player. Like at one point you see a rather well-dressed ghost that might steer you into thinking it could be a potential ally, only for it to turn out to be probably the most bizarre and sinister encounter of the game. Likewise, the strategic placement of collectible items could create some memorable events, like when returning to an old area that you previously traversed as a separate character, the exact location of where you fought a boss battle before, you can now find a new health item there, and if you decide to pick it up it results in you having to refight the same boss ghost again. First and for the most part I like this misdirect because it preys on your sense of safety, something that works well in a horror title, and secondly that it also plays with the lore of the area, like the location itself suggests that many people have met similar fates here, so it further bolsters the idea of these spirits being trapped in a never-ending cycle. In addition to that, as the game leaves this moment optional, you can't even complain about it being repetitive, since you can skip it if you desire, so it's almost a win-win scenario, especially on replays. Overall, I acknowledge that Maiden of Black Water possessed quite a number of bad mechanics, but I think its strong, immersive and deep positives far outweigh anything that might sink this title into the black water below. 67. Pikmin 3. Now, after playing Pikmin 2, I had low expectations for this sequel, as I thought that entry took the franchise in the wrong direction, but in addition to that, the new breeds of Pikmin introduced in this title, the Wing and Rock, also bothered me as well, as I interpreted it as the series turning away from its roots, as the winged ones appear more insect-like instead of plant-like and the rock one potentially not even being organic. Plus, I didn't necessarily like the idea of the titular species classifications breaking off from its color-themed roots. For reference, all prior groupings went by something like red, yellow, or blue Pikmin, so yeah, this concept kind of alienated me. In addition to that, the removal of the original protagonist and exchanging him for a new playable trio rubbed me the wrong way too. Now, in spite of all those bad signs, when I finally played this game, its quality actually surprised me, and even with aspects I doomed to failure, still somehow came off as enjoyable. For instance, the premise recaptured the magic of what made the first game's concept so great, as the new plot regarded its protagonists having to gather fruit on a foreign planet to prevent a famine on their own, so a time is of the essence narrative. Besides the two, due to a lack of supplies, the protagonists also had to consume the collected fruits as well, meaning that if they/you the player procrastinated too much, they would have less to bring home, further placing an emphasis on this narrative. I mention all this because I feel the second entry lost the original's allure/tension, since it became a tale of just trying to collect treasure over an unlimited amount of days instead of a story of survival, so it lost a true sense of conflict. Next, I view this as a good update on the original's visuals, not in the sense of graphics, but in cinematography, like instead of a region appearing on just a single map, it could be subdivided by transitional areas, and in these locations the camera view generally switched positions for a new vantage point, such as how it could assume a side view while traversing a root bridge connecting areas. Obviously it may not be that big a deal, but it looked cool and for me signifies how the franchise had arrived to the high-definition era. Other manners that embody the generational leap for the series involved how the environment itself could shift. For example, one boss could actually terraform the terrain of a sandy beach, like its underground movement could raise hills, and likewise burrow tunnels that would result in sinkholes that you and your Pikmin would slide into. By the way, neither of these cases happen to be point-specific locations, as it could occur anywhere in this plot of land, which makes this an even more remarkable feat, at least for its day and age. What also impressed me regarded how actual pieces of the map could move too, like on a river-themed level the flow of water pushed rideable lily pads downstream, so you could reach other areas of the map. To be fair, this feature sabotaged a really good run for me where riding the floating leaf sent me to a transitional screen, automatically disbanding all my Pikmin, and this occurred at the exact end of the day, meaning that if I didn't restart they all would have perished, because I failed to retrieve them before having to return to home base. Anyway, it may have been unfair, but it was such a chance occurrence that complaining about it would seem petty to me. From the last two statements, I'll just say Pikmin 3 felt modernized because of its more advanced physics too. Now, something I disliked about the prior Pikmin game involved how it reworked the yellow Pikmin to have an electric affinity, which I all around just think reduced the game by overly obsessing over elements. Plus, the usage of electrically powered objects in the game takes away from the original's more organic nature. Now, I still detest this fact, but I think the game implemented this aspect in a far more interesting way in this sequel, where in certain areas you might stumble upon severed electrical wires, and with the now electricity-resistant yellow Pikmin, you could order them to complete the circuit to fuel whatever object that these wires powered. I find this a more interesting use of this breed of Pikmin because they actually harness the potential of electricity and fulfill a greater purpose than simply destroying an object that they have a resistance to. I say that since Pikmin 2 really only utilized this quality to demolish electric fences, which just seems like an uncreative way to exploit an electric affinity. Another way I utter praise of this game revolves around how the bosses actually came of like bosses rather than just large enemies. For instance, the majority of them involved a stage transition to a new area, which as an idea, their separation from the normal maps, sends a message of them being special. To issue a few complaints, I have to say that the days, essentially the time limit per map, go by too quickly, which makes it hard to get stuff accomplished, and what kind of proves my argument regards how the re-release on the Switch actually lengthened the amount of explorable hours per day. Next, I wish the game more frequently harnessed using all three playable characters in puzzles or just in gameplay. Now, I'm not criticizing it for the times it explored this avenue, as I actually enjoyed those instances, but for how it underutilized this aspect, as controlling three characters does help distinguish this game from the pack. Lastly, to end this, I have to say that this title seems a bit too small in content, like the total count of different types of enemies barely increased from the last game, and map-wise the world only contained 5 explorable regions, one of which pretty much serves as just a location for a boss battle, so debatably it only had 4 true locations. Anyway, I'll go into greater detail discussing Pikmin 3 when I analyze the Wii U in a future video. 66. Shadow of the Colossus. A recurring trend I've noticed among more experimental video games revolves around how they often score very highly in the ratings department, but almost never achieve a perfect grade, and to me Shadow of the Colossus downright embodies this theory of mine. Part of this likely stems from their experimental nature automatically granting them an originality or a certain uniqueness, since they break from the standard norm, but at the same time I think that quality often simultaneously lessens the experience, as I believe the standard formula of which it deviates from became formulaic for a reason, and that's because it simply worked, and in all likelihood helped whatever titles that employed this method reach the top, so its omission probably prevented these more experimental works from earning a perfect score. Again, this is just my perspective of this overall style. Getting to the topic at hand, I view Shadow of the Colossus as basically a 3D Zelda game, which essentially removed everything except the boss battles, and the traveling to get to them. Much like how I stated earlier, this minimalist approach really makes this title stand out from any other video game, and in many cases I might consider this as a positive. For instance, I've always felt that grunt-style enemies seem like filler, so their removal in this game cut out something I deemed unnecessary, but regardless of the positives, at the same time Shadow of the Colossus still feels as if it is missing something to round it off or push it over the top. For the record, I rate video games on a letter-based scale, with an A+ being the highest. Now, I first experienced Shadow of the Colossus through watching it as a long play, and subsequently rated it as an A, but after playing and completing the game myself, I knocked it down to an A-. I mention that because I view this work as almost better off, or at least more enjoyable as a movie than as a game. For instance, the battles of Shadow of the Colossus primarily consist of climbing up creatures of titanic proportions, or sometimes the structures surrounding them, all to land a blow on a highlighted area, which in and of itself already presents it as more of a cinematic experience. Like the structure of the game more so tells you how to combat foes in a specific way rather than treating it like a fight about reacting to an unpredictable opponent. Likewise, the sheer scale of everything visually more resembles a movie than that of a video game, especially for its era. Besides that, too, omitting almost everything not a boss battle also provided this title the length and flow of a work more akin to a film as well. On the other end of this topic, the game's controls seemed a bit off, maybe even a tad onerous, which also makes watching this game unfold superior than actually playing it. Notable cases of this include riding horseback, where your steed borderline resists your orders in favor of following its own, which made some battles that require its use more difficult than need be, or another example pertains to climbing, where to do so, I'll say, requires more button input than necessary, thus overcomplicating it. If by description you haven't guessed by now, both these aspects maintain a heavy prevalence in the game, so yeah, a large swath of its gameplay feels unrefined, which again lessened my playing experience when compared to my time watching a long play. Similarly, in contrast to the typical style of gaming, the way in how you learn the location of the next enemy stands out as well, where to do so the playable character raises his sword, which produces several beams of light, and when focusing in the correct direction they begin to converge. Even though this may sound like a cool idea, in practice it can be a little more complex than necessary, as many bridges, mountains, and bodies of water divide up the map, so even if the rays of light tell you to go in a certain direction, it might not lead you down the right path, since something like a bridge might appear to lead you to the correct location, when in reality it actually takes you to a separate region. For example, one time during my playthrough of the game, me following the guiding light led me to the body of water of where I needed to go, but on the opposite end, and swimming across to the proper area would have actually taken up more time than simply reloading my prior save and restarting from square one, which I ended up doing. So even though this may be an interesting idea, it's fundamentally impractical and might send you on the wrong path. On that note, I must mention how Shadow of the Colossus boasts an expansive and rich in lore map full of diverse regions and terrains. Similar to the rest of the game, the story articulates very little on its world. For instance, if one never explores the setting and only plays this title to conquer Colossi, you'll actually miss out on several highly developed structures and lands, but overall that actually works to its benefit as it provides a certain mystique to the universe, and as well as induces a sensation that more exists in the world than the protagonist's own narrative. So yeah, it just feels rich in history. Shadow of the Colossus also deserves endless praise for how, despite resorting to very little dialogue, it somehow crafted a gripping tale with a surprisingly emotional climax. I intend not to spoil anything, but I'll at least say its relatively simple plot of beast slaying can easily mislead the audience, and make them question everything they performed or witnessed up until the conclusion. So again, on multiple levels its minimalism brings a lot to its story. To close out Shadow of the Colossus, I have to say I found greater enjoyment in analyzing it than actually playing it, and at the end of the day I think that carries greater weight than say a title that solely relies on the fun of gameplay, because even though it may have lowered on my list's ranking, after trying it out myself, it gave me something to think about that I'll remember years later, and that cements its status, whereas the amusing game that lacks artistic merit, that will increasingly descend down the rating board the further it gets away from the experience, meaning it lacks that same permanence because it relies on a temporary moment of emotion. So, again, as a game, Shadow of the Colossus has issues, but its quality transcends the medium. 65. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Despite me being a fan of the series, especially with what was the most recently released entry at the time, I hesitated to actually purchase this spin-off. First and foremost, my rationale for why stemmed from it releasing the year after I quit modern gaming, but more significantly because at the beginning of the game, I witnessed a character who I held in high regard get utterly dominated in combat. For the record, the prior title depicted this person as borderline unstoppable. With brute force he literally stopped an island-sized military battleship, so to me this moment from Metal Gear Rising just felt like it disrespected, if not betrayed, his identity or role within the overarching story, and considering how this released as a non-canon side project made it all the more worse. As I've become more media literate, and since years of separation made me more indifferent towards the franchise, I've somewhat brushed aside this previously unforgivable scene, as I later realized that this moment didn't necessarily intend to display the protagonist as losing because he was weaker, but because his opponent possessed superior technique and skill, meaning it more reflects a thematic application to this idea, and even if it may be a hard pill to swallow, I have to admit that, since brain and/or technique can easily prevail over brawn, the outcome of this battle at least dwells within the realm of possibility, so again I admit my own personal bias got in the way of me giving this game a chance. Secondly, I'm not all that partial to the cyborg protagonist's redesign/technical upgrade too, both in the sense of appearance and what it means, as this visually less pleasing upgrade, in terms of performance, makes his prior self an inferior model in the process, which inadvertently attacks the prior entries of the franchise as well. Last, and of least importance, I should also mention how me finding a copy of Metal Gear Rising on sale for only $13 also contributed to me giving this title another opportunity as well. Switching gears, I should say, even though this game does have a deeper meaning, I more so enjoyed it for entertainment value rather than on artistic merit. For example, like with how interactive and realistic its swordplay could be, as a matter of fact, if you specifically aimed to slice an opponent's toes and did so, they would typically react by grabbing their foot, so the programming of your enemies felt very immersive, and in the case I just mentioned, kind of funny too. On that note, I have to praise how much control over the protagonist's blade the game gave you, where you could strike with precision from almost any angle, which really provided a great sense of freedom. Building off of that, after defeating a boss, the game would go slow motion, where you could cathartically hack them into as many pieces as you desired, which if let's say you played on hard mode and previously struggled against them, this moment could be very gratifying. Another strong quality of the gameplay regarded how you could virtually cut any object on the map, which in and of itself had a fun power fantasy element to it. Even without the use of the sword, the action sequences of Metal Gear Rising excelled. Some moments included how the cyborg protagonist could rip the spines out of mechanical foes to recharge himself, or other moments depicted him as using active missiles as stepping stones to jump to the next area, which eventually transitioned into him running down a collapsing building all while dodging debris and even more missiles. So again, just the action sequences alone could be a great thrill ride. What ties in well with the game's over-the-top feats and battles would be its soundtrack, which seamlessly fit the mood, and even with how the person who wrote the lyrics went so far as to make the dialogue match the nature of the occurring situation, like the fight against the final boss references how he parallels the protagonist, or how the in-game rival siding with the villains corrupted his identity and sent him down a dark, bloody path. With all that said though, I don't think the individual tracks would be as good if experienced outside of these sequences. In all honesty, since they go a little over the top, they come off as a bit cringe, but because the game itself does as well, they mesh rather perfectly, and in doing so makes me like the soundtrack regardless. In terms of pacing, Rising seemed unbalanced and the story could feel underdeveloped or rushed at times, especially towards the end, like some of the later chapters occupied significantly less time when compared to the early ones, which makes them feel like they might be missing something. To be fair, even though it kind of makes things seem uneven, I did like that it cut straight to the point, so it didn't rub off as unnaturally prolonged without reason. Even though many of the bosses had themes, cool battles and even interesting abilities, their personalities still came off as unmemorable and a bit generic. Now in contrast, I really do like the final antagonist of Metal Gear Rising, Senator Armstrong, who needless to say with his immense charisma and snappy one-liners will definitely leave a strong impression. One reason of why he comes off as a more complex villain regards how much of his views hold actual truths, and from the fact that he actually practices what he preaches. One recurring comment you might hear about his personality and beliefs often goes as, how is he the bad guy? Mainly because he addresses many issues facing the current climate of the modern-day world and presents his solutions to them. Now this leads me to a fault in his writing, where the script forced certain awkward elements into his scenes/character to make him fit more of a villainous role. For instance, after a rather reasonable speech, a cutscene tricks you into thinking he won over the protagonist, only for the hero to call the senator crazy and attack him in retaliation. In all honesty, what he said didn't really sound unreasonable, and this moment kind of felt like it forced him to assume the role of the villain when he wasn't. Anyway, I could ramble on much longer about Senator Armstrong, but this really isn't the place. Overall, in terms of pure enjoyment, Metal Gear Rising is absolutely one of the funnest games to play, but thematically I think it might be a little overrated. 64. Dragon Ball Z, Budokai Tenkaichi 2. I rate this as the best among its own trilogy, because I feel it omitted the worst qualities of both its predecessor and successor, while also retaining their best aspects. Like the first, Tenkaichi split the fighters in all their various forms into different character slots, which not only prevented them from transforming mid-battle, but also weakened the immersion of the story mode too, as since characters could only maintain one form per match, that forced what should have been one complete level to divide up into many separate chapters, thus resulting in this adaptation losing as strong a sense of narrative progress as it should have had. Now Tenkaichi 2 remedied this issue by simply allowing characters to transform mid-battle, which in turn permitted an individual chapter to capture a full series of events and in one go feel like a full story. Now the selling point of this Dragon Ball video game adaptation subseries stems from how many characters of the franchise their releases included as playable characters, but by the third edition it kind of felt like the Tenkaichi series started to scrape the bottom of the barrel for new faces by including fighters that never really even had a true battle in the story, such as Baba D or King Vegeta. So many of them just seemed forced or undeserving of a spot, in saying that they weren't all bad, as this game did add a lot of characters from the Kid Goku days, or better worded as the era of the original Dragon Ball, but at the same time it does feel a bit awkward watching someone like General Blue take on a world destroyer like Majin Buu. Again, Tenkaichi 2 works the best because it maintained the right balance through who they included. Sticking to that point, this title finally added almost all the remaining movie characters to the roster, entities who strength-wise felt like they fit in the story, but have usually been underrepresented in the medium of video games, so it really helped create a sensation of expanding the universe without coming off as forcibly inserting someone who doesn't belong or seem unworthy of placement. For some this next point will be a positive, but for me it dulled any sense of achievement, and it regarded how in Tenkaichi 3 almost all the returning fighters were available for play right at the start, whereas in prior entries you at least had to beat their episode to unlock them as playable characters. So again, from my perspective, as everything I wanted had already been obtained, it lost much of my motivation to play. From that last statement you can probably conclude why I view the second iteration as the better of the two in this situation. Switching gears, I do like how this subseries handled its combat, where in battle instead of following the typical side perspective of other fighting games, it placed the view from behind your selected character's back, and likewise had them duke it out on a large open-world map, which more accurately captured the Dragon Ball style of fighting. Besides that too, since these massive environments allowed for greater distances between characters, that permitted for set pieces/destructible objects to be placed on the map, and that not only added more personality to the locale, but found a way to incorporate the finding of Dragon Balls in the game, as sometimes when you destroyed an object on that map, one of them would appear. So in its own way it represented the franchise through more than just its fighting. Being upfront, I fully admit I may confuse the content between each of these games, since they design-wise play similarly, as well as from the fact that they released yearly, so they don't exactly stand out from each other all that well, but in saying that I still view this middle child as the best. For those who don't know, the recently released Dragon Ball Z Sparking Zero technically constitutes as the fourth entry in this subseries. I felt the compulsion to mention that fact, since its inclusion renders some of my previously expressed terminology, like middle child, outdated. Again, I bring this up to prevent confusion. 63. Kinnikuman Muscle Grand Prix 2, Tokomori. I initially only played this wrestling game based on the popular Kinnikuman franchise with the sole intention of using it as background footage for my video analysis of the anime manga series, Ultimate Muscle, the localized name for this series sequel, but after recording all that gameplay I found myself enjoying this title so much that I decided to stick with it for longer than what work required. As a fun fact, if you watch that video, you can probably tell the order in how I recorded each playthrough, as in the process of playing them my skills gradually sharpened and improved, where in my earliest arcade mode runs I spammed the same special moves over and over again to barely survive, to by the final ones casually pulling off some of the most advanced ultimate techniques, while accumulating little to no damage in the process. Funnily enough, since I recorded the more discussed characters' matches first, their performances look worse when compared to those who carried less relevancy. Onto the game itself. Now if you're a fan of the Kinnikuman franchise you will appreciate how well this game represented it as a whole. For example, its roster consists of fighters spanning the story's entirety, from beginning to end, and even beyond that too, since it included several playable characters from this series' sequel Ultimate Muscle as well. Now I admit I kind of wish it would have better represented the scramble for the throne arc, particularly by having more members of Team Super Phoenix as playable, but at the same time I acknowledge they would have been the icing on the cake rather than a necessity. Anyways, this game still boasts an impressive cast, and dwells well above the what's required line. As with many Japanese anime originating from comics, between both versions, they often possess different color schemes for several characters, which in a game like this quite frequently divides the fanbase, but Muscle Grand Prix 2 went the extra mile to include both variants for most fighters who fall under this distinction, so besides pleasing fans of both formats, it in and of itself represents both artistic mediums. On the topic of appearances, this game also does something interesting in regards to costumes/alternate looks. For instance, in the story many characters adopt different personas throughout the timeline, like the character of Ramen Man temporarily assumes an identity known as Mongol Man for basically around 2 arcs or so. Now in Muscle Grand Prix 2 both versions of him are playable in one role through the use of different costumes, but if selecting his alternate persona, it doesn't just call him Ramen Man, it actually refers to him by his other identity, which even though this detail might seem insignificant in the long run, it in its own way better represents the franchise by essentially writing 2 characters into one role. Besides that too, it negates the sensation of it just feeling like a clone character used to pad out the roster to make it appear bigger than it is, so the game structured itself in a way that it received the best of both worlds in regards to costumes and/or alternate appearances. What might be the most unorthodox way in how this title represents the franchise's entirety regards how it includes in playable format a prior Kinnikuman game belonging to the NES era on its disc, so not only does Muscle Grand Prix 2 cover the anime and comic, but also, though not to the same degree, the video game adaptations as well. Another noteworthy quality of this game regards how it possesses a library containing dozens of still frames from the anime, which become unlocked if during battle you replicate certain moments from the show. In particular, I like this feature, as it adds an objective beyond just the beating of arcade mode as every character to this title, in saying that though some of these pictures can be hard to attain as it involved factors more than just performing a certain technique, like doing it while wearing a specific costume, on a certain stage, or against an exact version of a specified foe, so it did become a little complicated there. Lastly, to any out there considering playing this game, I have to warn you that this had never received an English translation, so if you want to give this title a go and don't understand its native language, know that you will have to guess your way through the main menu to get anywhere. 62. Yu-Gi-Oh! The Falsebound Kingdom. What may surprise many with the games of this franchise regards how even though it derives from an anime/manga card game, they aren't necessarily afraid to expand into other genres beyond just card battle simulators, and this title follows that path by crossing over into the territory of a real-time strategy game, in the vein of Ogre Battle, where it presents a tale including nearly all of the series' main cast trapped inside a simulated world and having to use monsters from its source material to form an army in an attempt to overthrow a false kingdom to escape to the real world. At the beginning of the story, you have the option of picking between two characters for your faction leader, the namesake protagonist or his rival, each of whom have their own story and cast of supporting characters acting as their commanders. Their divergent paths also unlock different recruitable monsters during said playthroughs. Of course, the majority of the time they often correlate to cards associated to whichever protagonist you chose in the beginning. You pick the franchise's namesake, you find his linchpin card, the Dark Magician, and if you went with his rival you inevitably obtain his iconic Blue Eyes White Dragon. I mention this because if you were, or had been a fan of the mainline series, this acts as a fun reference that makes the game feel more authentic to its source. On that note, your decided upon path doesn't mean you can't gain access to the monsters of the other selectable route, as after you complete the game, what you unlocked as well as the levels they reach carries over into subsequent playthroughs, so after beating both paths as well as the hidden unlockable third one, you can add any encounterable monster to your army, including the Egyptian god cards, which served as final bosses. You primarily recruit new monsters in 4 ways: defeat them as random encounters on unmarked places on the map, completing certain events or chapters throughout the story, using items to evolve previously obtained ones, or they already belong to a commander of yours, and automatically unlock when they join up with your crew. The combat of Falsebound Kingdom primarily acts like a turn-based RPG, where you have a commander of yours control a unit of 3 monsters, and they do battle against other enemy teams. As a real-time strategy game, you can send your commanders across a wide-open map to conquer enemy castles or specific foes. Likewise, you can even have some of them stay at the home base to defend it, if let's just say the opposition comes hunting for you. For the record, if an enemy captures your home base, or defeats your protagonist, you lose, and on the opposite end, you win by taking over your opponent's base, or by claiming victory over their leader. Usually the two coincide. Adding my own personal experience to the discussion, I played the rival's route first, which was definitely the harder path, as he came with the weaker monsters at the start and attained his stronger ones, which were fewer in numbers, later. So yeah, my first playthrough was a bit difficult, but after beating the game a couple times, all later replays became a breeze. I say this because effortlessly dispatching previously difficult foes proved very cathartic. Now, since I played this game nearly 2 decades ago, I felt a compulsion to look up how other people scored this game, and I noticed they generally perceived it poorly. As for this review, I'm purely going off of memory, so I wouldn't be surprised if their assessment was right, and mine was wrong, but I do think other key factors contributed to my overall opinion of this title's ranking. For example, I had never tried my hand at a real-time strategy game prior, so it just being a new experience may have ratcheted it up a notch for me. Whereas, say, if another reviewer may have been a veteran of something like StarCraft, they might observe Falsebound Kingdom as too simple or battle-oriented, so in one sense the lack of nothing to compare it to may have prevented me from picking up on flaws. Another recurring observation among critics I detected regarded how many of them called this game slow-paced, which on a first run-through of the story I agree with, in saying that though since I invested more time into understanding this title I obtained a few tricks in subsequent playthroughs to speed everything up, so in another manner, me likely devoting more time to this game than most other reviewers, provided me the chance to see its finer details that will presumably go unnoticed to those who just do a single run for a quick review. Lastly, even though I no longer have any attachment to the franchise anymore, I do have to admit that at the time of playing it I did, so since it adapted a show I liked during that era of my life, that too probably portrayed this title in a more positive light in my eyes than if I had no connection to it whatsoever. By the way, remember how earlier I referred to it as authentic to the series, so again that more than likely played a pivotal role in shaping my stance as well. Overall, even if fond memories of my youth swayed a potentially bad game towards a more favorable direction, I can't deny I enjoyed my time with Falsebound Kingdom back in the day, and that at least counts for something, even if the critics may be in the right. 61. Goemon's Great Adventure. Earlier, I expressed that I'm not the biggest fan of 2D platformers, but despite that I generally find myself fascinated by the ones of the 2.5D variety, as oftentimes I feel that they bring out the best aspects of both subgenres, and speaking for myself I think they frequently omit most of the elements that lead me to perceive side-scrollers as a bit repetitive. Getting to the point, from my personal opinion I believe Goemon's Great Adventure best exemplifies why I hold this belief. For example, even though I understand that 2D platformers possess a wide variety of gameplay types, such as how Sonic focuses on speed and momentum, Metroid emphasizes action/exploration, and even a water level from a Mario game can feature different physics than a land-based one, I still struggle to see them as different, because the view always remains from a side perspective. Well, with how 2.5D platformers incorporate depth, I think that breaks the sense of repetition for me, and also makes its on-screen image perspective-wise look more appealing. Tying this back to the second entry of the Goemon franchise on the Nintendo 64, commonly found throughout the world of this game, include paths that will often wrap around cylindrical-shaped structures, which again I reiterate I find visually more stimulating, as it creates a mental sensation there is more to the environment than just going to the right. Likewise, as this extra depth permits a third dimension that allows for more branching off paths. Before I continue, let me state I know 2D platformers can implement a similar practice, like in a 2D Mario game you might jump up into a brick block that sprouts a climbable vine which connects to an alternate ending to its level, so it has branching paths in that sense. But a 2.5D platformer like Goemon actually lets its paths spread out into different directions, like one route might continue forward and go over a bridge while the other dives deeper into the background and scales a cliffside. Again, apply the logic of my last argument to this point as well, but in addition to that, the extra layered paths makes these worlds seem less of a level 1-1 and more of a fleshed out environment. Switching gears, I previously stated how the structure of 2D platformers remind me of filing paperwork, something like World 1-1 to 1-2 and so on. Well, one way how the genre rectified itself for me regards how it opened up branching paths on the overworld map, which goes along the lines of beating stage 1-1 creates two possible routes, like going left sends you to level 1-2, while moving to the right takes you to 1-3 instead, which again breaks the sense of monotony. And if let's just say you struggle with one particular stage, you can have another option to continue forward. As you might guess, Goemon's Great Adventure implemented this feature into its design too, hence why I said this game includes many of the more redeeming qualities of its predecessor genre. What also shatters my perception of repetitive level design regards how this title occasionally has you return to completed areas to accomplish a new objective, like if let's just say you beat World 3-1, afterwards a person in 3-2 might request you go back to the prior stage to slay a certain number of a specified monster within a set time frame. Or another instance has you partake in a race against a speedy opponent in a previously explored area. Now I like this aspect because it prevents the idea that a level solely exists as just a stop on the way to a greater task, since returning for a new objective means that it carries more significance than just serving as a brief obstacle to something else. Likewise, revisiting an old location in and of itself stifles the notion of a formulaic, predictable, and repetitive level system. Now, even though in name, a stage could still technically classify as 1-something or other, from the perspective of story or through a sense of progress it doesn't, as let's just say 1-1 could also occupy the role of 1-3. Not sure how, but I've neglected discussing the strongest attribute of the game itself, its wacky and bizarre identity. Now, the setting of the game primarily consists of elements intrinsic to the Edo era of Japan, but surrealistically combines futuristic technology as well as mythological demons into the mix, all while adding in a dash of zany humor. Like one moment might involve traversing an old-fashioned Japanese castle, then suddenly switch to a boss battle against a mechanical fish monster, and to top it all off, a clash between giant super robots where for some reason a wife counterpart to your own roams the battlefield, usually comedically getting in the way, but if you wish you can switch to controlling her as well. In playing a level you can choose between 4 different characters, all of whom each possess their own unique skill sets and abilities, like the titular protagonist happens to be the only one who can break a certain type of block, another character happens to be a pudgy, ninja best friend, who wields a special megaphone that materializes his words, which can be used as platforms to reach higher places, and another option, a green-haired female ninja can transform into a mermaid so she can dive deep underwater. Now, in platformers, some people criticize having characters with different abilities, because it means you frequently have to switch back and forth between them, But this game handles moments like these rather well, where all it takes to select a different character involves standing on a panel, usually stationed close to an obstacle that requires a changing of the cast, and it simply floats you up to a magical tea house in the sky where the inactive characters rest. So, again, what it brings to the table far outweighs what some might construe as time-consuming hassles. Besides the diverse range of powers stands as one of the ways in how the game creates multiple branching paths, so it actually adds replayability as well. Focusing on the cast, I have to say their designs/original illustrations innately mesh well and complement the polygonal graphics of the Nintendo 64. For instance, the titular protagonist's naturally spiky hair works wonders with the native blocky shapes of its home system. Plus, utilizing Japanese demons as enemies almost automatically gives off an interesting look or style in terms of character designs. The setting/atmosphere too visually stun, like some areas throughout its world include Japanese castles and villages, misty forests, underwater caverns, demon world caves full of lava and torture devices, and a few areas that are borderline indescribable. To sum up everything, even though the Nintendo 64 houses very few 2D platformers, I have to say that because Goemon's Great Adventure addresses and corrects many of my grievances with the genre, as well as from the fact that it features an amazing art style and aesthetic, it makes up for its system's quantitative shortcoming, and I'd personally go so far as to call the game my favorite 2D platformer ever, even if it technically operates as a 2.5D1. 60. Sly 2, Band of Thieves. As mentioned several times by now, I'm a fan of 3D platformers, and even though some websites don't list this game as such, it still falls within the genre's boundaries. Now, the general plot of the story focuses on a trio of animals traversing the world, all to perform a series of heists, and needless to say that yields some great platforming experiences, as the preparation for their various schemes entail many stealthy activities that require jumping, such as climbing tall structures to go unnoticed or gain a better view, hopping from rooftop to enter a small window, or finding a way to get behind a guard to either elude their view or even to pickpocket a key off of them. Besides the platforming, Sly 2 features a wide variety of fun content, such as with the protagonist's companions, like Murray the hippo possesses a burly and stockier build, which prevents him from performing the same acrobatics as his raccoon pal, but in turn that grants him a high number of combat sequences or even cathartic moments of destroying your way through an enemy base. On that note, I always felt that playing as Murray served as a refreshing breather to break away from the more precise stealth-based objectives. Likewise, the other partner, Bentley, the genius turtle, has hacking segments, in which he controls a green tank-like figure along an aerial view of a 2D plane and guides it through a gauntlet of similarly shaped red enemies in an effort to insert his craft into a corresponding cavity in the periphery. In addition to that, this game often features turret-based missions. Since I'm a fan of collecting things in games, I should mention that scattered throughout each and every level dwell clue bottles, essentially the hidden package side objectives from the Grand Theft Auto franchise, and if you gather all of them within a certain area, they can be used to acquire a new power-up. So again, Sly 2 had a good deal of variety in terms of gameplay, which also alleviated a sense of it feeling too one-note, and on top of that, the diverse segments assisted in making the heists feel planned out, as many of these objectives helped set up for future events, like the turtle might use his hacking to disable a security system, or the hippo could use his muscle to break a machine that sounds the alarms, thus allowing for a scenario of Sly being able to enter a building more freely. While on the subject of the characters, I have to say, I just flat out like the idea that a game about professional thievery stars a raccoon protagonist, as it instinctively plays up the nature of the animal, like you commonly see raccoons climbing up trees and poles, and that's what Sly, the protagonist, does frequently during missions. Likewise, raccoons have a reputation for stealing food, and what happens to be the occupation of the titular lead, a professional thief, in essence the real world background of the game's mascot matches up with his intended image. Besides how his identity syncs up with his basis, the character of Sly succeeds through his personality too, as since he works as a thief and has no qualms of breaking the law, he doesn't feel like a bland, goody two-shoes, while at the same time the story doesn't force him into a malevolent role, so the writers found a good balance with his nature. In all honesty, I would describe him as having a charming and charismatic personality in the vein of Robin Hood. A strong suit of the game Sly 2 regards its vibrant art style, which breathes life into its locations through a comic book-like style, and maybe even throw in a little Tim Burton charm due to all the curvy architecture with sharp ends. Beyond that, the game excellently uses atmosphere to convey tone or mood, like even though both the location of Paris and Prague occur at night, the utilization of aesthetic helps differentiate them, like Paris has a bluish night sky which makes it seem tranquil, maybe even resembling a painting akin to, say, Starry Night, while Prague, on the other hand, takes place in a militaristic prison setting and possesses a reddish airspace, which immediately exudes a more dangerous or sinister vibe, and the locale also supplements this atmosphere all the more with sharper corners, lots of fences and barbed wire or even barred-off windows, which emanate a sense of feeling trapped in an ominous area. Since this next aspect doesn't necessarily pertain to the game, but as it still conveys my thoughts, I thought I'd mention it anyway, and it regards the fact that I specifically played this second entry of the series, because I learned that it happened to be the best reviewed of the franchise, and a motive of mine has me wanting to try at least one game in all major video game series, and even though I've already fulfilled the goal of my obligation, at least for the Sly Cooper series, I'm not opposed to trying out the other titles, and I think my willingness to return to this franchise speaks for itself in regards to Sly 2 Band of Thieves. 59. Castlevania, Legacy of Darkness. If by any chance you've heard about this title before, it will likely have been about how bad this game was, and that it serves as the poster child for series that struggled with the transition from 2D into 3D. As you might guess from its ranking, I disagree, and speaking for myself, I would go so far to say that among all the Castlevania games I've played, which include 1, 3, Symphony of the Night and Judgment, I personally view this one as the best. An argument for why I dismiss many reviews critiquing Legacy of Darkness regards how most of their complaints generally apply to the other, more praised entries of this franchise, but just don't get acknowledged. Like one critic disliked how they had to resort to using cheats to beat the final boss, which I myself had to do as well, but with all due respect, the franchise itself has an infamy for having nearly unstoppable final bosses, like I only managed to beat Castlevania 1 and 3. Because I use save states, which itself could be construed as a form of cheating. Besides the two, I've heard other people mention how they couldn't beat those bosses even using save states, so again, if it applies here, then it should there as well. I've also heard many joke about the game's various time anachronisms, such as how early on you stumble upon skeletons riding motorcycles, while again, much like my prior comment, the other Castlevania games contain continuity issues too, like a recurring boss of the franchise would be the Frankenstein monster, which from its original source material was chronologically a product of the 18th century, while in Castlevania 3, set during the 1400s, appeared as an enemy, dressed in the same attire as the 1931 film, by the way, so it too broke continuity. Admittedly, it may not be as blatantly obvious that it misdated certain characteristics, but it still did it anyway. To say this, I'm fine with anachronisms if they fulfill a greater purpose, and that's what Legacy of Darkness did with its inclusion, as it enhanced the atmosphere, again a subject I highly value in art. Like one sequence involved simultaneously escorting and protecting a child through a hedge maze while hunted by a chainsaw-wielding madman. Again, this might be 100 years too early for a gas-powered chainsaw, but it does make the scene seem more sinister and exciting than if it followed a sword-wielding maniac instead. Similarly, another level involved traversing a conveyor belt while dodging streams of electricity. Time-wise, this may contradict the period, but it still added a fun and memorable platforming segment to the game. The next frequent criticism of Legacy of Darkness pertained to how early on, one moment set aboard a ship involved jumping onto an invisible platform to continue on to the next room, which many have deemed as bad game design, since nothing in the level hinted at its inclusion. For me, I accidentally discovered this hidden ledge before even realizing it led to the next area, so it didn't exactly ruin the experience for me. In saying that, though, I understand the critique, but at the same time I don't perceive that aspect as any worse or unfair than some of the tricks employed by the Metroid franchise. For the record, even though they belong to different series, I contend this a fair comparison, since many lump these two series together into a 2D platforming subgenre known as Metroidvanias. Like quite a number of times in Metroid, I found myself stuck in having to spend an hour or so retreading the entire map because I didn't realize that the path forward hid behind an inconspicuous, destructible wall, which by the way I only found after resorting to looking up a walkthrough. Let me just say I actually view this case as worse than Castlevania's, since as this occurred later in the story I had more map to comb, whereas in Legacy of Darkness, even if I didn't unintentionally stumble upon this platform, because it took place so early in the game, you barely have any areas to backtrack to find it. So yeah, if this quality brought down a 3D Castlevania game, it should probably also demote a highly praised 2D Metroid game as well. Breaking away from the whataboutisms, and articulating on the strengths of this game, for starters, of all the Castlevania entries I played, this one has by far the strongest story, as it follows the werewolf Cornell as he seeks to rescue his sister who was captured by the minions of Dracula, but as his narrative progresses and more details get revealed, you the player learn that more than meets the eye dwells within the relationship between him and his sister, so it develops over the course of the story. Whereas to me the plots from the rest of the Castlevania series appear bland and one-dimensional in comparison. Essentially they sum up as, you are blank Belmont, go kill Dracula, and that's that. Now maybe they might feature a poignant moment here and there, such as with Symphony of the Night, but they are far and few between. In terms of boss battles, or at least with their mechanics, I will say I think the 2D Castlevania games prevail in this category, but this 3D entry of the series excels in its own unique way, in how it takes advantage of its extra dimension, to craft a more atmospheric scene, like fighting a flying harpy atop a castle during a thunderstorm, where it can attack you from any angle carries an epicness that couldn't translate over to 2D. As I just mentioned, combat, what deserves a mention regards how Cornell can transform into his werewolf form to gain a power boost, as well as gain an immunity to certain status ailments, like if bitten by a vampire, and left untreated, it will eventually kill Cornell, at least in his human form, but during his transformed state it will have no lasting effects. Plus being able to quicker blitz through enemies without having to worry about taking damage comes as an added bonus as well. So this inclusion does add a bit of a power fantasy element to his character, which vicariously carries over to the player. On another note, this game features an interesting cast of characters, and inserts them into memorable scenarios, like a strange merchant who gains power every time you make a purchase, and if you do it too many times he becomes a late game boss. Going off on a tangent, what I think justifiably lessened the perception/rating of this game revolved around its release back in the day, since it marketed itself as a full game, when in reality it basically acts as an expansion pack to Castlevania 64. For reference, besides Cornell, this game features 3 other playable characters with their own independent stories, in saying that one of them really shouldn't count, as his narrative comes off more like a hide-and-seek minigame rather than an actual storyline, and 2 of the 4 characters' stories originated from Castlevania 64, but got carried over into Legacy of Darkness. What I'm getting at is, factors external of the game itself likely influenced its score. For example, having to basically rebuy the same game at full cost for an additional character would likely antagonize its audience, and negatively impact its reception. Likewise, even if it may be the superior version, because it reused almost everything from Castlevania 64, that might also cause some people to view this iteration as a lazy cash grab. So to put it bluntly, even if Legacy of Darkness had strong merits in its own right, its fumbled release had to be taken into account as well if justifying its purchase back in the day. Returning to the topic at hand, my final thoughts. Now, even though I don't view Legacy of Darkness as the most polished or refined Castlevania game, I still maintain that it gave me the higher highs when compared to the rest of the franchise, and also that it wrote and constructed the most memorable moments of the series, and at the end of the day, to me that holds the most weight. So that's why I go against the court of public opinion and call it the best Castlevania game. 58. Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Similar to Smash 64, I've somewhat had a positive change of heart towards Brawl, though not to the same degree. Putting things into perspective, I'd say the release of Super Smash Bros. Brawl was the most anticipated I've ever been for a game, and once I finally sunk my teeth into it, I'll just say my expectations were not met. Part of this stems from me thinking that the jump from this game's predecessor, Smash Bros. Melee, could replicate the massive leap from Smash 64 to Melee, which in the end it couldn't, and that disappointment blinded me from seeing some of the game's positives. Besides that too, I felt the inclusion of third-party characters corrupted the image of this Nintendo franchise, which to this day I still feel as well. For example, during that period I viewed Metal Gear as a PlayStation-exclusive franchise, and on top of that too I felt that the series' more realistic nature clashed with the cartoonish soul of Smash Bros., especially since its representative, Solid Snake, had to have his arsenal watered down from its original depiction to be suitable for the game. Similarly, I also kind of wonder if that potentially stole a slot from a more fitting and deserving Nintendo-based character. At the time I really wanted Golden Sun's Isaac to join the roster. What also bothered me about Brawl regarded how, since it properly indexed or categorized everything, it felt smaller than what it actually was. For example, the game cataloged every major unlockable behind a grid-based screen in a sub-menu, now even though in reality it possessed a substantial number, because it put everything available on display, it just innately induces a, that's all there is, perspective. Putting it bluntly, revealing the confines, limitations, or borders of something will make you think about how little space it is left, making it seem smaller in the process, whereas withholding the numbers of what might be remaining. What this game's predecessor did, automatically creates a sensation of something feeling limitless or more wide open, even if it technically contains less content. Upon reflection, I realized that I focused too heavily on the negatives of this game, causing me to overlook its positives. For example, because I felt Brawl didn't introduce enough new Nintendo-based franchises into the roster, I ultimately failed to acknowledge the value and originality of the new characters they did include. For instance, many of the fighters that Smash Bros. Melee added to the roster just happen to be clones or reskins of existing characters: Mario, Dr. Mario, Link, Young Link, Fox, Falco, Marth, Roy. Oddly enough, the antagonist of Zelda harbored the exact same moveset as Captain Falcon, whereas the new characters of Brawl, other than a few exceptions, operated differently than the older ones. Like the techniques of Wario allowed him to eat projectiles or even ride a motorcycle, so he wasn't just another Mario clone. Fire Emblem's new representative, Ike, may have had one charge-based move similar to Marth, but unlike Roy, everything else diverged, so again most of the new entries of Brawl played uniquely and didn't function as a copy. While discussing the new additions to the roster, I really have to praise the inclusion of Pokemon Trainer, as it really encapsulated the nature of his franchise on so many levels. Like him swapping between 3 different Pokemon reflects how its home series uses a party-based system, likewise all 3 of them being at different evolution stages, indirectly incorporates the practice into Smash Bros. And also this served as a good way to add characters to the roster without making them feel like they stole a spot from a more deserving character. Like on their own, 2 of these 3 Pokemon haven't necessarily earned their place in the game, but because they technically register as one fighter, they more so create one unique entry rather than come off as a waste of 2 slots. So basically, it allows for 2 extra, distinct characters that would otherwise feel out of place to be in the game. Onto 2 aspects of the game that I'm more neutral towards. To begin, the newly incorporated Final Smashes, which act as a super move to all playable characters. In some cases I fully support their inclusions as they better represent their respective character or franchise, like Link's had him replicate the killing blow at the conclusion of Ocarina of Time, or even though Mario technically never performed his final smash in any of his games, the concept of him launching a tornado of flames still seems genuine to his identity. Now on the other end, some characters' ultimate moves felt forced or disingenuous to their own series, like for some reason Yoshi sprouted wings and could breathe fireballs, again that does not embody him as a character. Or even with Luigi, who for some reason induces several status ailments upon his opponents, which in concept bears no semblance to any aspect of his identity. Besides that, all 3 Star Fox representatives shared a final smash, which just seemed lazy. So, again, some final smashes were great, while others felt forced, disingenuous, or all around lazy. In a weird way, I do somewhat believe final smashes cheapened the game as a whole by turning the series into more of a traditional fighting game rather than being its own subgenre. On another note, I'm also a bit ambivalent towards its story mode, known as Subspace Emissary. First off, let me state part of my mixed feelings towards this feature stems from me thinking that some people overrate this mode by treating it like it's a gripping, well-written narrative, when in reality it's adventure mode with a bunch of cool cutscenes. So I'll say I'm happy with its inclusion, but I don't see it as anything special or legendary. Beyond that, I also have to say this made some characters too easy to unlock. Now, in all fairness, I believe Melee went overboard in the requirements for unlocking its last 2 fighters, so one might interpret it as a correction, but for me, acquiring the entirety of the cast just felt unearned in the end. Because everyone mentions this, I'll address it anyways, and it involves the infamous inclusion of fighters tripping mid-battle. In all honesty, I don't care, and it didn't lessen the experience for me. Being upfront, the first time it occurred for me, I thought it happened in Melee as well, but I had just forgotten about it. Overall, I have a complex relationship with Super Smash Bros. Brawl. I think it did a lot of good, but I believe many of those positive qualities allowed entrance for bad ones as well. 57. Jak 3. I already expressed my sentiments on the first entry of this franchise, so before continuing this subject I should share my opinions of the second game too. Now with Jak 2, I felt it had excellent atmosphere, an interesting setting, and even a better story than its predecessor, but at the same time it possessed such a high difficulty ceiling that it quickly lost any sense of fun. I temporarily dropped it to play its sequel first, and only returned after finishing it. A good mission that embodies my stance of the game involved an objective where you had to deliver an item within 3 minutes, which entails driving a vehicle with poor steering all while traversing very narrow alleyways that are easy to get lost in, as well as crash into. And even though I succeeded with this objective on my first attempt, I had less than a second remaining on the clock, even with no wrong turns or collisions, so it cut everything too close for comfort. In saying all that, these slender passageways really reflect the nature of the world, as a totalitarian government controls and closely monitors all of its citizens, so these compact streets supplement the idea of how the hierarchy treat the populace like inmates of a prison, by cramming them into small enclosed sections. Again, a cool concept, but it can make for unenjoyable gameplay. Getting to the game at hand, the sequel, Jak 3, it basically takes the best aspects of its predecessors, while also removing their faults and rolls them into one game. It returned to placing a greater emphasis on the collectibles system like in the debut title, while at the same time still retaining the good identity-defining atmosphere of the middle entry. For instance, at the beginning of the story, the titular lead finds himself exiled from the city of the second game, and has to spend much of his time wandering a desert for citizenship in a wasteland village. In one way, how this aspect creates both a fun explorable area, like that of the first game, while also establishing a strong identity for the locale, as in Jak 2, regards how it placed a greater importance on vehicles and transportation. For example, the narrow alleyways of the second game yielded a feeling of imprisonment, while in the sequel a vast open, bordering on lifeless desert promotes an opposite, but equally as defining sensation of feeling far away from civilization, putting it bluntly being exiled, plus a dry and barren environment innately sends a message of a hostile world, hence bringing identity to the setting, and likewise as this map spans a large area with many different terrains, adding in more vehicles, actually made traversing the world both fun and practical, unlike the tight streets of its predecessor, which just made movement a pain. Plus many of the vehicles fulfilled greater roles than just going fast, like certain ones specialized in combating enemies in the wastelands, or another featured hydraulics letting you jump high into the air and reach previously inaccessible areas. In addition to that, the more refined controls and handling substantially improved this aspect too. On a side note, some of the best times I had with this game involved going full speed across an empty area, or driving up a cliffside ramp to see how far I could go. So again, Jak 3 has the aesthetic depth of the second game with the fun of the first. Similarly, the middle entry of the franchise introduced a new weapon system, which its follow-up enhanced by tripling the available number of them. In addition to that, Jak 3 expanded upon the power-up from the prior entries of the franchise. For reference, Jak 2 added a dark form for its protagonist, which once again its sequel retained in its gameplay, but with that came a light counterpart with extra abilities, such as temporary flight, self-healing, and the power to slow time. To say this too, the dark form really only served as a strength-based stat booster, so the light form went several steps beyond that since it wielded new abilities. Of minor consequence, I should also mention how this third entry reintroduced the riding of animals mechanic, which had been cut in the second. Obviously this might not be of the greatest importance, but it served as a good callback to the past, and it added a little flavor to the culture of the wasteland town. Not to spoil anything, but this game's story hit a good emotional climax towards the conclusion, where it displayed both inspiring and tragic moments, all while going out with an epic ending, easily the best ending of its trilogy. While on the topic of story, I should also mention how later on in the game you can return to the city that you had been exiled from, which again serves as a good callback, and adds a little variety to the setting, plus it actually simplified the map, as I'll just say a main enemy altered some of its landscape. One criticism I should mention regards how a very important character from the past two games suddenly got pushed to the back burner, and basically another member of the cast assumed their original role. Besides the two, their dialogue had been recorded by a new voice actress as well. Now I'm not complaining all that much about this aspect, as I'm not exactly a fan of this character, and their existence forced an implied romance side narrative, but I still have to complain about it, as its inclusion definitely broke the immersion of the story. Lastly, I view this as the best entry of the Jak and Daxter franchise, because it corrected and learned from its past, and overall provided the most enjoyable experience. 56. Katamari Damacy. Now many might find the sheer bizarreness of this game a little off-putting, and casually dismiss it. In all honesty, when this title first released, I belonged to that persuasion as well, but if you can look past that, you'll experience some of the most fun in video gaming. On that note, I do have to say the controls might also take a while getting used to as well, but again, once you acclimate to them, playing Katamari Damacy will become an instant pleasure. Now the premise of this game involves starting off each and every level as a teeny tiny man pushing around a small ball known as a Katamari, capable of increasing its own mass by rolling over similarly sized objects and interweaving them into its own heap. Think like a snowball increases its own size by rolling over fields of snow. So in both gameplay and concept, this title already carries much originality and distinctness. One of the greatest thrills of this game involves seeing how massive a size these balls can attain. For reference, a later stage might begin with a Katamari around the size of an eraser, to by its conclusion, reaching a scale gigantic enough to swallow up entire islands. Likewise, as it acquires more mass, it opens up new areas of the map to explore. Like the base form of a Katamari might be restricted to a small enclosure, but once it passes a certain measurement threshold, it can consume enough material to roll over its former boundaries. What adds excitement to Katamari Damacy regards how many levels create the sense of a challenge by establishing mission objectives. Now many of them follow a common goal of reaching a certain size with said Katamari ball within an allotted time frame, something like within 5 minutes be capable of rolling up human-sized objects. So since this aspect opens up room for failure, that in turn also grants a sense of accomplishment for completing a stage. Even though from my own perspective this type of gameplay feels fresh for the entire duration of its run, to prevent the possibility of repetition, the developers behind this title set different objectives for the other levels too, such as avoiding certain creatures or rolling up as many of one specified object as quickly as possible. So in other words, the game does possess at least a little bit of variety. A personal criticism of mine for this game pertains to how I thought there should have been more locations between all the levels. For example, 3 areas, which I'll call House, City, and Islands, cover 22 stages. If you're feeling generous and count the credit sequence, you can up that number to 4, but regardless, zone-wise the levels themselves could come off as redundant due to their repeated uses. Though in its defense I will say, the sense of perspective in its own way can make 2 of the 3 stages seem somewhat like new or different areas, since the growth of the Katamari changes the view, that in turn can portray an old location in a new light to make it feel fresh. Like on the island map, once the Katamari accumulates enough mass to consume whole buildings, it will look like a different location from where it started, since where it began will visually look smaller in comparison. With all that said though, I still wish there would have been another map in this game. On to why I called the game bizarre. Now on concept alone, Katamari Damacy already seems strange, but its weirdness goes beyond that too. Like a flamboyant character, known as the King of all Cosmos, sends the player on a mission to make these Katamari with the intention of transforming them into stars and or constellations, so a literal out there goal. Besides the 2 for a very happy, light-hearted game, it's oddly unconcerned with death, like these Katamari permit the rolling up of people and animals, which will send them to their doom, meaning the plot possesses an underlying darkness, so the dichotomy between its jovial presentation and its rather grim undertones makes the nature of this game strange as well. On top of all that too, this universe and its inhabitants come off as bizarre too, like the levels themselves contain a randomness, like you'll encounter stacks of people on top of each other, superheroes clashing with villains and even earthly deities. In addition to that, the designs of said populace don't follow normal humanoid shapes either, like the playable character basically has a sideways soda can for a head, normal humans appear strangely blocky, and several of them possess exaggerated qualities, like overly long pompadour haircuts. The music of the game also feels abnormal, exotic, or foreign, but at the same time strangely catchy and almost nostalgic at times. With all that said though, all this bizarreness has a captivating charm to it, and from a personal perspective I have to say one lost to time, especially in regards to console gaming. Overall, Katamari Damacy is a fun, charming and utterly bizarre game. 55. Diddy Kong Racing. Right off the bat, I'll flat out say this title beats out Mario Kart, and I'm not just talking about Mario Kart 64 either. For starters, it makes its rival look bare bones in comparison by containing far more content, like instead of browsing through a menu to select a course, Diddy Kong Racing possesses a hub world to let you drive to your track, which within the racing genre already gives this game an identity and provides you something to cruise around even when not in a race. Besides that too, this inclusion allows for scenic exploration. In Diddy Kong Racing not only can you race on land, but also by sea and air, as this game features 2 extra types of vehicles, such as the hovercraft and the plane. Though this game may not harbor as iconic a roster as Mario Kart, it still stars some other famous Rareware characters, like Banjo from Banjo-Kazooie and Conker of Conker's Bad Fur Day fame. What also separates Diddy from specifically Mario Kart 64 regards how you can unlock additional racers after achieving certain requirements, meaning that its completed roster surpasses the total number of playable characters of its rival too. On top of that, the cast includes characters beyond just the racers, as it also incorporates boss battles, or technically boss races, into the game, something which I might add Mario Kart also lacked. Among them include a Triceratops, an octopus, a dragon, and an evil magical pig. Though this may sound controversial to some, an elephant genie with an Indian accent acts as a means of exchanging your vehicle, and upon doing so he'll utter magical phrases like alakazam or abracadabra, which certainly adds a little personality to his character and the game as a whole. Remaining consistent with the Nintendo 64-era games of Rareware, Diddy Kong Racing also contained collectibles that can be gathered during races, such as coins that unlock harder variations of the bosses, or special keys that unlock a challenge mode. By the way, the developers got creative in hiding them. To find one of the more memorable keys involved during a castle-themed race, turning around, thus going against the direction of the track, and driving up a retractable moat bridge to a concealed platform above the stage. Even though much of the game has light-hearted, even childish-sounding music, which is actually a good soundtrack by the way, it still could forge more intense moments, such as the climactic first encounter with the final boss, which occurred at night during a lightning-ridden rainstorm all while playing more dynamic music. To write a little bit of my own personal experience into this review, I'll say even though I beat the final boss and also watched the credits roll, I technically never finished Diddy Kong Racing, as a hidden post-game world set in outer space unlocked afterwards, which I never knew existed till I stumbled upon a long play on the internet, so that in and of itself shows the depth of content this game wields. Final thoughts, without a doubt one of Nintendo's best racing games, in my opinion maybe even as high as number 2. 54. Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas. Among the PlayStation 2 era of Grand Theft Auto games, I considered San Andreas as the most fun to play, or at least in the sandbox department, but in contrast to its generational counterparts I'd lean more towards categorizing it as a toy rather than a work of art. Like anytime you hear this title referenced, it mostly associates with its memes or more indulgent style of gameplay. Such cases include the humorous lines of Big Smoke, flying around in a jetpack uncharacteristic to the setting, slash times, or what used to be a more popular gag in the past, where in multiplayer mode you could force two dudes to kiss each other. Again, the times have changed, but everyone joked about that back in the day. With all that said, I'm not claiming there to be no artistic merit to the game, but it just doesn't emphasize it to the same degree as its predecessors. Putting it bluntly, you're supposed to interpret GTA 3 and Vice City more like serious crime dramas, whereas with this title it treats itself more like a goofy comedy. What describes many of my issues with the final member of the GTA PS2 trio would be by saying it became too big for itself to handle. For example, the game added in many extra features that felt underdeveloped or just even borderline unnecessary, like two aspects include a dating system and a body mass mechanic. Now both these inclusions came with some positives that I'll praise, like dating a police officer allowed your character to retain your weapons if arrested, and if the person you played is exercised frequently, that could grant him extra stamina while running. So again, they did have good qualities to their names, but for the most part I just see them as overcomplicating everything. A negative aspect that concerned both of these aspects involved the requirements to date certain ladies, like one woman desired your character to be very muscular, but not fully maxed out, which could be a hard balance to find, and likewise maintaining that body type at lengths could be a pain too. In addition to that, this title expanded upon its predecessor's hidden package side quest by providing each region of the map their own set of collectibles. Even though I'm a fan of this mechanic in other games, I've always felt that the Grand Theft Auto franchise took this aspect to such extremes that it lost the fun in it, or at least once you neared the final remaining few. But again, San Andreas went far beyond its counterparts in this regard, like the Oyster subset could be located in any body of water found throughout the map, which, considering you can't breathe underwater, made this all the more impractical a collectible, and likewise with the snapshot collectibles, which entail taking photos of specific landmarks. I never even managed to capture one of them because I had no idea where to even start. Like, even if I looked up a walkthrough that correctly marked the area, I still didn't know what to do, as even if I took the photo of the location, it never registered me as doing so, even if I completely followed the directions. Keep in mind this game predates YouTube, so I couldn't exactly get video footage to point me in the right direction either. In its defense, I should mention that these collectibles classify as optional side missions, so collecting them isn't a necessity, but it still made me feel like I couldn't experience the full content of San Andreas. On a similar note, this title possessed several unfair or downright awful obligatory missions. Now technically all members of this trilogy included a mission that I flat out hated, but here's the thing with the other games, they felt within the scope of what Grand Theft Auto missions should be about, while many of those from San Andreas seemed hard because they ventured outside of the natural territory of the franchise. Like one mission universally recognized as poor, occurred during flight school class, where it required you to perform a barrel roll through checkpoints, and let's just say the game held you to extremely high standards in receiving a passing grade. Besides that too, it didn't exactly have the best handling either. Again, it's cool that this series allows you to fly various aircrafts, but considering they aren't flight simulators, they shouldn't demand that high of technical skills to pass, especially for a mandatory mission needed to complete the story. Another difficult and obligatory task forced the player to use a forklift that handles rather poorly to load incredibly fragile crates into the back of a truck. Again, a fun concept for this franchise, but poor implementation. Now, some people might not have had issues with this following aspect, but since I've heard several other people agree, I'll say it anyway, and it pertains to rhythm-based dancing segments, one of which occurs as part of a mandatory mission where you have to use the hydraulics of your lowrider vehicle to make it dance. Again, I struggled here, and you all probably get the picture by now. Likewise, I have to say this game's predecessor Grand Theft Auto, Vice City, featured a notoriously difficult RC helicopter mission, but one in particular from San Andreas makes that look like a cakewalk in comparison. Also, due to this becoming a meme by this point, I feel compelled to mention the mission, Wrong Side of the Tracks, where all you had to do was follow a damn train, which somehow became one of the most infamously hard missions in the history of the medium. In all honesty, if it weren't for like 10 bad missions, this game would probably have ranked in my top 25, but again, just because the sandbox content might be fun doesn't negate these frustrating obligatory moments. On another note, its previously mentioned massive map, which resembles the real-world cities of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Las Vegas, plus a little extra rural country land. In a certain sense, its large size indicates how the game struggled to contain itself, such as how earlier I said some areas seemed underutilized, but in addition to that, the two latter towns never feel as fleshed out as the first city, but in its own weird way that works as an advantage to the plot, as symbolically it meshes well with an overarching theme of its story, through the idea of losing touch with your roots. Like the game opened up with the protagonist returning home to his old stomping grounds after the death of his mother, and much to his distress many of his old acquaintances now view him as a coward that left everyone behind when the going got rough, so that's the first prevalence of this theme. Now later on, a police setup forces him out of his home turf and results in a rival gang taking over his former territory in his absence. Flash forward ahead to when he has found great success in the other cities of San Andreas, where upon reuniting with his just released from prison older brother, he offers him the chance to leave behind the old neighborhood and share in his newfound luxury in one of the other towns, but upon hearing that opportunity, his sibling castigates him for once again running away from his problems. So this situation also represents how success caused the protagonist to lose sight of his roots. Tying this back to the main point, if San Andreas developed those later areas to the same degree as the first, and made them seem just as homey, this theme wouldn't have landed as hard. And likewise, from a perspective purely based on distance, the massive map symbolically reinforces how far away from home he has ventured. So yeah, in a thematic sense, I believe that its gigantic map worked in its own favor, even if it could have been fleshed out more. For the record, this topic also stands as why I said even though this game rubs off more as a goofy toy when compared to its counterparts, it still holds artistic merit. I should mention that in how San Andreas broke new ground in the franchise, did come with some positives as well. Like earlier I mentioned how fun territory wars and recruiting your fellow gang members could be. Besides that too, this game also possessed an RPG system of sorts where you gained experience from repeatedly using certain weapons, which could provide you bonuses like improved accuracy or even the ability to dual wield. On another note, in preparing for this video, I rewatched footage of the game and I noticed that it actually foreshadowed several moments rather well, like a person who later betrays the protagonist comes up with a comedic, yet considering his established nature totally believable excuse for why he neglects assisting the hero during a clash with a rival gang. Why, from my perspective, I also view San Andreas as beneath its fellow members of this trilogy regards how its protagonist seems more immature than his counterparts. Like, I'll just say he often comes off as a bit indecisive, and needs his brother to push him in the right direction, whereas the leads of the other Grand Theft Auto games display more confidence in themselves, and know what they need to do. Now, for that very same reason, I will say I can understand why some people might view the protagonist of San Andreas as the best, since it depicts growth or character development. But for me, I just kind of find themes like that a little cheesy. Overall, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas is a fun game that has issues that one simply can't gloss over, which in my opinion unfortunately prevented it from reaching the pinnacle of greatness. 53. Dead or Alive 2, Hardcore. First off, let me state, I know the Xbox re-release of this game outperforms the PlayStation 2 version, and even possesses additional characters at that too, but since I played the latter, I will focus on that one instead. To start off, this happens to be another fighting game where I only intended to try out an arcade mode or two, but because I enjoyed this experience so much, I just kept on playing. Believe it or not, I actually beat 50-man survival mode with the majority of characters. Part of the reason of why I view this as one of the best fighting games ever made regards how it's just downright beautiful to watch, and I'm not just talking about the fact that a major selling point of this game revolves around how much of its cast consists of busty, scantily clad, ladies overdosing on jiggle physics. Its allure goes way beyond that, where I'll flat out say it has some of the best and most fluidic animation of any fighting game. For instance, older titles generally have clunky movement, while newer ones go a bit too fast for my tastes. In other words, Dead or Alive 2 just hit the right pacing for me. In all honesty, I constantly spammed the grab button, not because it could serve as a cheap tactic to win, but just to appreciate how outstanding and intricate those moves looked. Besides that, what astounded me with those techniques regarded how everyone possessed more than just a single grab, like one might entail grappling your opponent, somersaulting over their head, and using the momentum for a throw, while a different one might have that same character jump onto their standing enemy's chest, and repeatedly kicking them till they hit the floor. What surprised me even further regarded how I accidentally discovered that the boundaries of the arena could also be incorporated into throws, like with the aforementioned character, where one time when I performed a grab near a wall, resulted in my character grabbing their foe's head, somersaulting over them, and kicking the periphery to land a knee to the back of their cranium. So, yeah, the sheer intricacy and interactiveness of the techniques and their animations highly impressed me. Since I just discussed how the game incorporated the environment into the battles, I should also mention a similar feature as well, where on some stages if you landed a heavy blow on your opponent near an edge, that could knock them off, and create a stage transition. For instance, one fight might begin on a balcony overlooking an opera, and if you successfully perform a knockback attack, your target will plummet through the railings, resulting in the match continuing in the auditorium below. Anyway, these stage transitions looked gorgeous and added some more depth to the combat. Now, in all fairness, not every arena contains such feature, but if they fall under that category they generally had an equal substitute, like other levels might have electrical wiring around the arena, which if you get launched into, it will inflict damage via a shock, so again it might not be as beautiful a cutscene, but at least it provides the area a little more identity. With this next point, you'll have to take me at my word, since I can't really prove it, but Dead or Alive 2 had some of the most fluidic and responsive controls of any fighting game I've experienced. In all honesty, it just felt right to play. For all intents and purposes, this definitely comes down to preferences, but I like the retro arcade fighter feeling of this game, the kind where you can't tell if the female announcer actually speaks English or not, but anyways, for what it's worth, I just see it as a cool nostalgic charm. As with most games, Dead or Alive 2 isn't above criticism. With that said though, most of it dwells outside of its combat and or gameplay and reside in the more technical aspects. Like unlocking all the outfits for just even one character, let alone the rest of the cast, required you to meet far too challenging and time-consuming objectives. For those wondering, that's why I beat 50-man survival mode with several characters. Continuing on that subject, many of my other issues stemmed from the roster as well. Now I'll say I consider the female characters original and unique in their own right, but unfortunately with most of the male cast members they often seemed generic or felt like the developers stole their characterizations from an existing fighting game franchise. Cases include the wise old martial arts master or the gigantic wrestling grappler. Basically, I'll call the ladies great, again for more reasons than just their looks and appearances, but the men felt bland and underwhelming, if not archetypal. Again, I consider this a minor complaint, but many characters' arcade modes reuse the same cutscenes over several fighters, which can just seem a tad bit lazy overall. Final thoughts: if judging Dead or Alive 2 hardcore solely on the merits of its genre, I have a strong inclination to call it the best fighting game of all time, as the only ones that I rank above this title on my list only win because of side factors or connections to other media. 52. Bully. As this game restricted the Grand Theft Auto formula to a school setting, one might expect this title to flop, since it inherently limits the potential activities of the gameplay, no driving, toned-down violence, or constricting the arsenal of available weapons to non-lethal ones. But in spite of all that, the developers of Bully somehow used the obstructed range of this project to their own advantage. For example, even though firearms may have been off limits, it instead focused on improving hand-to-hand combat from what it was in Grand Theft Auto, by emphasizing techniques over simply throwing punches. Like one move you can learn involves kicking your enemy's leg to trip them. Besides that, this game incorporates grappling into its combat, which permits you to throw your opponent to the ground or toss them into objects. Admittedly, it might not be as advanced as the Yakuza series, or even Rockstar Games' prior title, The Warriors, but it still improved upon the fist-fighting of Grand Theft Auto. Needless to say, even though this game might lack usable firearms, it still had weapons of its own to mix up the combat, which include items like firecrackers, a spud cannon, cartons of eggs, bags of marbles to trip your enemies, and a trusty slingshot for long-ranged action. In its own way, one could argue the exclusion of firearms brought out more identity to the game, like some of the other weapons fulfill a different purpose than just mowing down your foes. In addition to that, these items reinforce how the story revolved around schoolyard hijinks. Speaking of that, the setting of the world primarily centered around a small boarding school and its quaint surrounding town, and not some massive sprawling city like in Grand Theft Auto, which in its own right grants a unique luxury to the game, through how minimizing the cast allowed for every single character to have an identity. Like every person you see walking around the map isn't just some random character model used to simulate the illusion of a larger populace. For reference, in Grand Theft Auto you might spot several of the same character models spawning in one locale, meaning that one design intends to represent several different residents of whatever city said story takes place in, whereas in Bully one character model represents only one single character. In essence, the game feels like a community of distinct individuals rather than a town of nameless drones. Beyond just looking different, every character, even minor ones, possess their own unique idiosyncrasies, and contribute to the story in some way or another, to at least somewhat serve a greater purpose. For instance, one relatively unimportant character to the overall plot, named Ricky, aided the protagonist in a fight against a clique known as the Preppies, after witnessing the gang steal a trophy off of the hero, and because he held a grudge against the group, he offered to help him out. Within the story, he never hands out a mission, or fulfills any other major role, but he at least has this one moment, so you can say something interesting about him. And on that note, basically every character within this story has at least something to this degree, that if you have to discuss a character, you could mention something they did. Similarly, when either engaging in battle or just even roaming around town, you'll hear the populace mention random lore, which can also make characters seem like they have more going on with them than just serving as some blank space-filling drone. Returning to the character of Ricky, in fights he'll mention how his girlfriend just broke up with him, and wants to take out his rage on you, or whoever he may be roughing up. So again, the game tries to make every person feel like they have something going on within their character. Going off on a tangent, one issue I have with the game, Bully regards how the cliques of the school can feel a bit too formulaic, which rubs off as contrived. For instance, every group has at least one female follower, a black member, and a male romanceable option. Let me just say, I'm not speaking out against this aspect to sound exclusionary or anything of that ilk, but in several cases it breaks the nature of said gang. For example, the Preppies consist of rich, elitist, blue bloods who openly proclaim how their families prefer them dating their own cousins to going out with someone of a lesser standing, so in their case having a dark-skinned character within their circle somewhat contradicts what they thematically represent, as it portrays them as more inclusive than exclusionary. Switching gears for a second, I have to praise the script of this game as it features many humorous lines, and tying this back to the main topic, this quality also better interconnects the setting to its characters, like when doing a mission for the nerds, they will tell you to go find Cornelius, and will subsequently say if you don't know who he is, you can recognize him from his amazing performance as Juliet in the school play last year. For those who may not understand, his role in the school theater implies he likely had to kiss another man during his performance. How that works into the lore regards how he happens to be the male romanceable character within the nerds clique, so not only does this line of dialogue tell a joke, but it also indirectly suggests more about the orientation of said character. From what you might guess, Bully has other instances of revealing and comedic dialogue, but I don't want to drag this on any longer. On another note, with all the unique factors of this game, its gameplay included a diverse range of mission and side objectives, like the slingshot allowed for sniping side quests or riding on the back of a vehicle and firing at your pursuers. Even though the protagonist may not have been of age to drive a car, he could still ride a bicycle, which in turn permitted racing missions. As you possess throwable objects, some quests entailed egging people's houses or breaking their windows. Weirdly enough, 2 stealth-based missions involved sneaking into an insane asylum to free an inmate, so yeah, Bully had a wide variety of content. On that topic, it also featured mini-games through school classes that if beaten could provide your character upgrades. For instance, shop class occurred as a rhythm-based segment, and if you passed one you permanently unlocked a bicycle outside your dorm room, and beating further courses improved the model of your bike. Likewise, winning at a game of dodgeball during gym class improved your accuracy with your slingshot. In all honesty, one of my favorite side objectives involved taking a picture of every enrolled student at your academy to complete the yearbook. One issue that I have always had with the PlayStation 2 era of the Grand Theft Auto franchise regarded how every entry had at least 1 or 2, in the case of San Andreas a dozen, bad or outright unfair missions that flat out ruined the experience. Well, with Bully, every objective or side quest came off as within reason and nothing seemed broken or poorly programmed. So to me, this doesn't have the same collateral damage as its brother series. Lastly, a few grievances with the game. First off, despite the jocks classifying as the kings of the campus, their presence and the chapter dedicated to them underwhelmed and just came off as rushed. Like their leader, the coolest kid in school received little to no attention in the story, and the boss battle against him required only one single blow to land to defeat him, so again the plot did not do enough with him to make him live up to his reputation and status. Next, when I first played this game back in the day, I would have considered the Greasers as my favorite clique, but upon revisiting this title, I honestly felt they appeared out of place. Like the idea of a rather large high school group that dresses and acts in a style rooted in the 50s just rubs off as silly for a game set around the time of its release. Maybe with 2 or 3 characters this idea would work, but not a full gang. Likewise, their role within the story intended to replicate the motorcycle gang archetype, which due to their age they couldn't really fulfill, so the story instead had them operate as a bicycle gang, which in all honesty just looks cringe now. I've got more to say, But I've spoken long enough and have to move onwards, so to say this overall, even though Bully can feel a bit immature at times, it still grade-wise rivals many of its more adult brethren in the Grand Theft Auto series. 51. Conker's Bad Fur Day. From my perspective, a good phrase to describe this title would be by saying, I have no idea how this made it in, and in mentioning that, this expression derives from two key factors. Firstly, how a Nintendo 64 cartridge fit a CD's worth of content into its limited amount of memory space, and secondly, the question of why a company typically known for family-friendly games allowed into its library one that unabashedly depicts raunchy content. Now uncharacteristic to its home system, Conker's Bad Fur Day managed to squeeze an entire script's worth of recorded dialogue into a single cartridge, which for its time was a rarity, and even then most games that attempted this practice usually contained only a minimal amount of lines, so already pulling off this feat served as a great accomplishment. Additionally, the voice acting expressed great personality and sounded rather well done. I say this because oftentimes I find that games, especially ones of this era, usually only have one or the other. Like to me, some of the most charming performances frequently sound unprofessional, which generally helps them stand out and feel distinct, but oftentimes means they can't emote all that well, resulting in more serious moments rubbing off as awkward. And likewise, many times when a company hires better and more talented voice actors, they don't exactly own the role, like they can express the correct emotions, but they don't fit the part, or fail to make it seem any different from their dozens of other roles. Whereas the acting of Conker's Bad Fur Day accomplishes both, like the titular lead has a high-pitched and goofy cartoonish voice that sounds like it could have originated from a children's show, but at the same time it can still deliver more adult moments, like lustfully admiring a giant cavewoman, or talking while intoxicated, so it harbors both personality and skill. Other stylized voices with great performances include an opera-singing Mountain of Pooh, a menacing vampiric squirrel that looks straight out of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, and a mad scientist weasel with a cartoonish German accent. Switching to the more mature content of this title. Contrary to most beliefs, the library of the Nintendo 64 went way beyond the perceived image of just cartoonish animal mascots, and actually possessed quite a large number of more adult-oriented games, such as Resident Evil 2, Shadow Man, the Turok franchise, Mortal Kombat 4, the list goes on, but what makes Conker a unique case among them regards how aesthetically it embraced the console's child-friendly persona only to turn it around and use its likeness to present more adult material. Like violence and lewd content, which in its own way bolstered its impact and also introduced a black comedy element to it. For example, the protagonist of the game happens to be a brightly colored squirrel with a high-pitched voice, something that you'd expect to see in a kid's cartoon, but despite his appearance the story never shied away from placing him in adult situations, like an underwater segment involves him swimming through pipes littered with industrial fans, and if he fails to make it through, the blades will graphically chop him up into bits, now visually as you wouldn't expect something that resembles media for kids to portray graphic dismemberment, that produces a greater sense of shock when it occurs, than say a similar scene originating from adult-oriented content with a darker aesthetic, like the previously referenced game of Shadow Man has torture chambers and waterfalls of blood, so seeing one of its characters undergo an identical scenario meet with a similar end wouldn't seem too out of the ordinary for its world, meaning it wouldn't catch you as off guard. So basically the juxtaposition of two non-associated qualities amplify their combined effects in Conker's Bad Fur Day. Plus, as morbid as this may sound, the image of cute little critters dealing with unspeakable cruelty unintentionally evokes a dark sense of humor, since it breaks an unwritten taboo. Again, it's twisted, but true. Likewise, with great success, this game repeatedly ups the ante just when you think it hit its limits. For example, one boss battle against a gigantic caveman featured the protagonist riding a dinosaur, and to damage your massively sized opponent involved stunning him with a headbutt to the groin, thus causing his pants to drop and you had to run behind him to bite off a chunk of his rear, which needless to say leaves a real nasty-looking injury. But then Conker manages to take it a step beyond that, where after a set number of times his loincloth permanently falls off, which in an uncensored fashion exposes everything below the belt, and in full view reveals that let's just say he hit a diminutive member. Just so everyone is on the same page, yes, this cartoonish-looking Nintendo game depicted nudity. Now I will say I have seen other playthroughs that censored this scene. I think it might be from the Xbox Rare Replay version, but anyway my copy depicted this moment and censored. With all that said, as this game continuously pushed the boundaries, its unadulterated gratuity never became old. Just to prove the lewder end of the mature content wasn't a one-off instance, I'll say an earlier scene focused on a buxom sunflower begging for a bee to pollinate her. Re-examining this title, I expected much of its humor to have become antiquated, or look relatively tame, since later media became a bit raunchier too. Like looking back at it, the idea of a singing mountain of poo might seem juvenile by current standards. Going off on a bit of a tangent, a trend I've noticed regards how when media tries to act more mature it unintentionally makes it look more immature in the end. Now because of that pattern I assumed Conker's Bad Fur Day succumbed to this trait as well, but much to my surprise I found that its comedy still made me laugh, so I think its humor aged decently. Like one thing that got a good chuckle out of me from rewatching its story mode involved how a busty and super attractive cavewoman had the name Jugga, so yet to me its humor felt natural rather than forced. Now even though I spent the last few minutes treating this game as just a lowbrow comedy, I do see some artistic merit in it too, like it actually kind of excels at foreshadowing, and her plot structure, like the story misleads you into thinking that soon-to-be important aspects that fulfill a greater role in the story, at first merely serve as nothing more than just background props for a one-off joke. So because many elements add up, and secretly set up for future events, it does prove that it knows how to tell a story. In addition to that, you can find a bit of a message in the identity of Conker, as in a certain sense he receives poetic justice towards the end, as throughout his narrative he narcissistically brushes off those displaying kindness to him to further his own ambitions, and in the finale his self-serving attitude costs him the one thing he actually desires, which results in him ending up alone, or at least symbolically. Likewise, the game concludes the way it started, him intoxicated and aimlessly wandering off, implying Conker to be stuck in his self-destructive cycle, and that he failed to learn anything from his adventure. Now I'm not insinuating the story of Conker is on the level of a Greek tragedy, but it definitely has more to it than something construed as just a raunchy comedy. What even adds a layer to the story pertains to how an intentionally unexplored lore ties him to the seemingly random antagonist of the game, the Fairy Panther King, in which the vampire character casually explains that a peace treaty between the squirrels and the panthers fell apart hundreds of years ago, so that does leave an impression that this world may be more thought out than it lets on. A critique of the game that prevents it from ranking higher regards the fact that it simply wasn't as fun to play or well designed as other rare developed 3D platformers. For example, Conker's jumps didn't feel as seamless when compared to those belonging to its brother series, Banjo-Kazooie. Likewise, several segments/minigames throughout the story had either poor controls or felt unrefined. Like one objective involved hoverboarding over lava while pursuing enemies in a tight and bumpy cavernous locale, and the vehicle itself had all-around poor steering, which made this moment way too difficult. Similarly, another level transformed the protagonist into a vampire bat, where he had to capture living targets and drop them into a meat grinder. Once again, poor handling made this moment arduous. So, overall, much of the actual gameplay prevented this title from climbing up in the rankings. For the record, over a decade ago this title used to place in my top 15. In spite of that setback though, I must admit I have a soft spot for this game as it introduced me to my favorite film, Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, and likewise it referencing/parodying so many movies inspired me to get into cinema. In all honesty, if I never played Conker's Bad Fur Day I might not have found a hobby in analyzing media, so without it I likely wouldn't have uploaded this video, or possibly even started this channel, so regardless of the fact that it may not have the tightest of gameplay, it still left a profound impact on me. With that said, I think now might be the right time to close out part 2 of this video. Just like last time, I'll reiterate that if a game you like rated lower on this list than you think it should be, know that 132 is a relatively small number in the overall scheme of things, and I didn't choose that number out of sheer randomness, but because that happens to be the amount of video games that truly matter to me. So instead of perceiving it as ranking low, interpret it as having enough value to be worthy of praise in my eyes. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, hopefully you all enjoyed it. Just a question for those watching, with the remaining list, I'm interested in knowing if you all out there want it split up into 2 separate videos, or if I should just lump everything else into one massive upload? Input would be appreciated. Again, thanks for watching.